I could not believe what I was seeing. I could have filled the back of his head with 5.56, which is an absolute joke.
Well, it's not an ape, because if the Sasquatch was an ape, we would already have one.
What are these elusive hominids that stalk the wilderness? Your host, two-time witness and field researcher for more than 40 years, William Jevning. Welcome to the mystery. Welcome to Creek Devil.
Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Creek Devil. We have a very special guest today, and Tom, I'm going to let you do the honors to introduce her and take this away.
Yes, absolutely. Debbie, thank you so much for coming on, and you and I had a great little chat about the Bigfoot, what we call Bigfoot in the United Kingdom, and I just want to say that you have a different word for it over there. I love the word. It's apropos. It makes sense. And can you tell everybody, what do you guys call Bigfoot?
Historically, it's called the woodwose. Some people pronounce it as woodwoose, but there are other regional names like your bugger or your wood bugger or your zummet. We tend to have some very strange names for our upright, hairy hominid, shall we say. I'll use that word because it covers a wide spectrum of two-legged things.
And I think you also, the one that I really liked was, you guys sometimes call it a caveman. Is that right?
Oh, the wild man. Sorry, I should have gone to that straight away. Yeah, 9 times out of 10 when a report comes in the UK, it's very rare that you hear the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Most people will say a wild man, and then you have to get the description because very similar to the rest of the parts of the world. Some are very Sasquatch patty-like, some are very caveman-like. And the ones we tend to get more of in the UK are this caveman, almasty-looking, almost Neanderthal, should we say, or Heidelbergensis, that kind of thing, a very hair-covered human, but much shorter, probably about 7 feet tall, not your massive giants, but very similar to your American Sasquatch.
Yes, it sounds like it. I'm going to have Will jump in a second, but Will, based on what you've heard, I would say it sounds like you have both the patty type, which over here we refer to as a type 1, but also the one that is what we call a type 4, which is much more human-looking, but one of their distinguishing features are, of course, a hair-covered man, but they have, I think, what anthropologists call spatulated hands and feet, exaggerated hands and feet. Mm-hmm. Well, go ahead.
I was thinking about that, and I wanted to ask, people making the reports are the ones that look more Neanderthal-ish. Do they report hair on the face or not?
No, that's very rare that you actually get this complete hair-covered face. We hear about hair on the chin and around the face. Actually, I had an experience myself when I was very young, and I distinctly remember a leathery skin and hair around the jawline, but not covering the faces. I don't think I've ever taken an account where they actually speak of a completely hair-covered face.
That's very interesting because that's the real distinction between, what we refer to as a type 1, like we see in the Patterson film, which does have a much hair-covered face, and the type 4. And it's interesting. It makes sense in that part of the world. I mean, typically they're on the North American continent. They're in the northeastern regions, eastern Canada, and in the from Minnesota east in the States. But it's very interesting.
I've taken reports from all around the world. I've been incredibly lucky. And I think across southern and eastern Europe and Russia, you have a very almost caveman-like appearance going on. And as you move further towards the mountains, as we pass through the Almas, you start to get this much hairier, much bigger in build type creature. And obviously we move across to Canada. I was speaking to a gent from Edmonton not too long ago, and he was at Slave Lake hunting, and he didn't know what to describe he kept saying the creature that he saw. He said it looked like some kind of wild man, but it was attacking a moose, in all honesty. He'd never heard the word Sasquatch before. He hadn't even heard of the hairy man legend. So once we got chatting, he thought it was some kind of upright bear with human features, because he was just really struggled with what description to put on it. And I think that's much the same for the Brits and the Europeans. We don't have a word that covers anything that's up. You know, you got your Bigfoot, your Sasquatch, and it's not an everyday word. We don't watch it on the television. Now we do, you know, but even going back 5 years, you'd be hard pushed to find somebody that, unless they were had the interest or were an avid researcher, that would actually know what that word meant. So we've come quite a long way in the last 5 years in the UK. We're doing much better.
Debbie, I wanted to jump in for a second. And when you and I talked the other day, correct me if I'm wrong, did you have an encounter yourself early on? And that's kind of what got you on. And as I remember, you're very thorough and very detailed in your approach to kind of working out what you saw.
Yeah, I think when it happened, I had no idea what it was. I'd never heard of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, anything like that. And I really didn't know where to go with it. And it was incredibly frightening, because I wasn't out in the wilds. I was not that far from town. I was in a place that was very heavily wooded and a lovely place to be, but not the type of place you'd expect to see something like that. So the fear of it shut me down for a very long time, but I started what you'd now call research, my way of lessening that fear, to be thinking that you're the only person out there that's had this experience on the entire island. And then realising as you go through that other people have actually made the reports. There are reports out there if you look for them. And it was just, that's what set me on this journey, Tom, was just I'd meet a witness, we'd go through the process with them, and then I'd move on to another witness. And then as technology advanced, I was able to speak to more and more people, and it's just kind of led me to where I am today.
Can you tell us a little bit, fill us in, give us some details about how old you were and your experience, and what did you see? Tell us what happened.
I was 15. I would say it was probably May or June. It was quite nice. The weather was really nice. It was sunny. I had another girl with me. We'd had a break at school for lunch, and we should have been going back in, and we decided that we weren't going to go back in. We skipped school. And there's an area that's called a country park, and it's not the most rural place, in all honesty. There's an old mansion house there, and there's some gardens and these animals and these wooded areas and things like that. And basically, it was an old overgrown area that was kind of entangled. It was all rhododendrons, and they crop up for some reason, often with the sighting reports. And we were in there, we were ducked down in there, and the idea being that when you're in the roadies, you can see out, but people can't see in. And we were just hiding from the teachers, in all honesty. Completely normal day. I noticed a movement very quickly within the greenery. And at the time, I thought it was a monster. This face, I only saw it from mid-chest as it leant out of the bushes. I made eye contact with it. I looked at it, and it was absolutely terrifying. And I don't know why I did this, and I'm very ashamed of it to this day. But my first reaction was I pushed my friend to the floor. That's how terrifying it was, so that it would get her. And I did that without conscious thought. And I was just up on my feet, and I was running. And I looked back to see if he was following me or if he'd got her. And it had gone. It just kind of melted back into the greenery. And that was all I had. And then I don't remember, probably the next half an hour because he just kept running. My next conscious thought was coming to on what you would call the freeway and realising that I had to cross that to get home. And that was my first conscious thought after that moment. I can remember his face like it happened yesterday.
And
he
this was...
like a man and an ape pushed together almost. Very, very pronounced brow ridge, very muscular jaw. His hair was really, it wasn't black, but it was really, really dark brown. But where the sun caught it, it was almost auburn. His eyes were amberish in colour, and there was some whites, but they weren't white. They were almost yellowish, like jaundiced. The face, the skin on the face, it wasn't old, but it was very leathered and weathered, tanned, like a tanned leather colour. And he had these wispy hairs on his chin, that's what I remember. His teeth were square. There was no canines or anything like that. And it just looked at me. It didn't do anything more than that. He just kind of leant out and looked at us. And obviously I pushed her and ran, and she ran in the opposite direction. And it was very strange. It was like the next day we just avoided each other. It was like we didn't want to speak about it. And I kind of I think I blamed her for being there, and she blamed me for being there. And we've spoken about it since, because obviously we're grandmas now. We're in our 50s, and she wants nothing to do with it at all. And I can't find out enough about it because I want answers. I want to. But as you know, you both got decades of research. Every time you find an answer, it just leads you on to more questions. So that's kind of where I am at the moment.
Yeah. How far was this when you saw it? Was it like just right there and you're, like a few feet away, or? Yeah,
I was laid down on the ground. We were both laid down in there in the den, and it just leant out forward. So I'd say I'm opposite, probably 6-7 feet, something like that between us. And I don't actually remember why I pushed her. I just know that I did it without thinking. It was like a basic primal thing. I was up, pushed her down on my feet, and I ran, and that's how frightened I was. I thought it was going to come out there and get us, but I mean, I'm one of the lucky ones. I managed to find another 7 people that saw it in the same place, and I was looking in the early years, some of them reported to American researchers. Then the American researchers got in touch with me many years later and told me about these cases. So there are other people in my town. One lady was named Brenda. She saw it 2 years after me in exactly the same place. But she saw all of it. And she said it was completely hair covered. It had a pot belly. It had a hunched stance to it. She said it looked like a chimpanzee on steroids. So this big hairy chimp, but much bigger and more muscular. She said it was clearly male. It had genitalia, and you could see that it had genitalia. And she described it as having an almost pig-like nose. I don't remember that. I remember a flattish nose, but I don't know if that's because we were looking from 2 completely different directions. I'm not really sure about that. The other people that have reported a very similar creature to that, but also in a silver or grey colour. And those reports are the most recent ones, which makes me wonder, is it the same creature that I saw much older? Or, do we have to go down the line of, is there a living population of them in the UK?
Well, you would think that there would have to be some kind of a breeding population. And I want to go back to the facial description. Mm-hmm. What can you describe a little bit about the mouth? Did it have lips? How big was the mouth? That sort of thing.
Very similar to ours, I would say. Somebody asked me many years later what the canines were like, and I remember thinking there weren't any canines. It just had square teeth like us, kind of a bit slack-jawed. It didn't bare its teeth. It was just kind of slack-jawed. It had just thin human lips. The nose, to me, looked almost flattened, like a boxer, like somebody who's boxed a lot of the time, and they have that flat. There was nostrils, but it was much flatter to the face and wider than a human nose. I don't remember cheekbones, to be honest. I remember those very muscular. That's what I concentrated on. These muscles around the jawline looked like they could have just bit through an arm or bit through a leg. That they were intense. I remember thinking at the time when I was really upset about it, my dad was a big man, a very, very big man, and he was a handyman. And it looked like it could have just picked my dad up and threw him. It was this massive, muscular man-ape. And that's what I called it for a number of years until I saw the Sykesville monster. And it was like looking at its brother or its cousin. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was close enough that it took me right back to the moment. I remember saying to my husband, that's it, that's what I saw, that. And then we started looking, and I said, it can't have been, that's in America. And so I can't have seen the same thing that was in America, but it looked very much like the Sykesville monster, same facial kind of expression, but what I saw was much wider and hairier, far hairier. And somebody else asked me not too long ago what its ears look like, because obviously now, 40 years on, I take reports of dogman-like creatures or creatures that are snouted. So the ear position is very important. And I don't remember seeing ears. So they can't have been on top of his head. They must have been like a human at the side of his head, because I don't remember seeing them at all.
Let me back up for just a second. You mentioned the Sykesville monster. Give us a little, just kind of a brief, what is the Sykesville monster? Where is it located? Tell us a little bit about that.
The Sykesville monster, as far as I'm aware, what I was actually doing was somebody asked me if I could draw what I saw that day, and I'm an absolutely terrible artist. I can't do it. And it was a lady called Alex Evans, and she's an American lady. And she said to me, if you could go on Google, Deb, and find something similar to him, we could start to work with that, and we'll do it in an almost photo-fit way where we'll change his eyes. So we were just looking for a starting base. And I was looking at things like Heidelbergensis, Heidelbergaster, any of the upright, tall hominids that probably walked the earth at some point. Didn't find anything that was, just no cigar, if you get what I mean. I kept thinking, yeah, it's similar to that, but that's not it. So I start looking at anything. You just start gambling with words. So you're putting in upright, hairy, two-legged. And I hit on the word bipedal. So I put that in, and this photograph came up, and it's from America, from Sykesville in America. I'm not really sure what state that's in. And a number of witnesses in the area had seen this upright, 8-foot-tall, hairy, typical Sasquatch. So the sheriff of the town got all of the people together, and he did a photo fit. And they all agreed that this photo fit looked like what they saw. And that was the photo fit that I saw online. I was on an old clunky laptop back then. It was a huge laptop. And it actually frightened me. I slammed the laptop lid and I started to cry, because I'd spent, at that point, 25 years apologising for the fact that I'd seen something strange. And it just took me right back to that moment, and it was as clear as day again. I kept saying to my hubby, that's him, that's who I saw. That's who I saw that day in the park. That's him. And then I was really disappointed when I realised he was in America. And then I thought, well, I can't have seen him. And that's what led me to American Sasquatch. And then I was off, and I was like, right, I understand this. It did have broad shoulders. It didn't have a neck. And I am 99% certain what I saw is of that family somehow. But how I saw it where I was is still something I'm struggling with to this day. But if anybody wants to Google it, it's just Sykesville, S-Y-K, Ville, and it's in America, and it pops up. I think it was Lon Strickner, but don't quote me on that. I might be wrong on that one, because it's not a picture I like to look at, so I've never really gone back down that avenue. And I was lucky that Alex was able to put a photo fit together for me from that original picture. So I do have something that looks like him, but it wouldn't be good enough in a court of law. Do you get what I mean? I just wish I could get his face out of my head down onto paper so I can say that's what I saw that day, you know. But that's impossible, unfortunately.
Right, and I think it is. I think the Sykesville monster is I think it's from Pennsylvania.
It is Lon Strickler.
Is it? Yeah. Right. Have you seen it? Have you seen the face of it?
Yeah, actually, I was just looking at it.
What broadened the eyes, around the eyes, there was a lot of muscle. It had a very pronounced brow, and there was much more muscle. You'd have to kind of widen the face of the Hatswell monster more. And I distinctly remember the muscle. I don't know if it's to do with chewing or it's just that's what they look like, because it's been mentioned over and over again by other witnesses to them in the UK and across Europe, to be honest. And it's this very powerful jaw. I'm sure you're similar with the story of Zara, the Russian owl master. She had a very pronounced jaw. And I remember speaking to Iger about it, and that was the thing that I concentrated on the most, was the eyes and the jaw, because it was so powerful looking.
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture of it. It's and the other one that I'm looking at is, from your description, what you described kind of reminded me of something that is it's called the Minnesota Iceman. I don't know if you've seen that one or not.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very chimp kind of, because it's got a clear face. There's no hair on the face.
It has that pug nose.
Yeah. The picture's quite grainy for me. I can't... to try and get that to this glaring image that I saw in my face, which, he was just... Yeah, very similar to that. The flat nose is exactly right. The nose is right. Just a thin, normal human mouth. The brow ridge was a little bit more pronounced than that. And definitely no hair on the face. I'm just looking at the photograph that you sent over. I think I might actually have. Just 1 second. I might have. No. I thought I had one on my phone of him. I'll pop one over to you later, and then you can have a look at it. Alex did a fantastic job with it, I'll be honest. The one I'm looking at now gets reported most often in Scotland, in the UK, in the Highlands, in the big mountain ranges. You get that typical patty-looking, Sasquatch-type-looking creature that I'm looking at now.
Talking about Highlands in Scotland, and I've looked at some of those, not in relation to this, but just in terms of, I love the wilderness and that sort of thing. And it's very beautiful. I think they have some pretty high elevation mountains up there. And so you do get reports from Scotland of people who have seen a similar creature.
Yeah, you get very similar to America. You have the 3 mountain ranges. And the sites kind of follow those ranges, that the high areas of high rainfall, where the deer go, really. We have high mountains, we have valleys, very similar to some places in America. And if you start to plot the sightings on a map, which is something I do, in the hopes, really, if I was trying to work out if there was a migratory pattern, or if there was some kind of pattern to the seasons when people were seeing them, they tend to follow the mountain ranges. And as you get further towards Scotland, there's an area in England called Northumberland, and it lies right on the border with Scotland. And it's also an area that's got ideal habitat. And we have an almost route plotted. They follow the mountain, they follow the rivers and the mountains, and I think they cross the border. And this is only a personal theory of mine, but in the UK, food comes into, from the north of the UK to the south, the weather's very, very different. So down in the south, it's much warmer. You have a better climate, and edible food, foraging food comes into season much earlier. And then that travels up the country, and Scotland is one of the last places where things come in to ripen. And I'm almost of the opinion that they are following the food, because we seem to have these distinct migratory routes. And all these years on, I know that in the early months of the year, January, February, if we get any activity in the woodlands or any new reports, that's where they come from. And that kind of followed a pattern, and it's still, this year it's different, and I think that's to do with the lockdown because there's not as many people out there. But we have had reports. We've had 3 recent reports while the lockdown's been on, and one of those was in Scotland, and it's because it's such a vast area. The gentleman there, his is the only house for acres and acres and acres, and the only thing he's got behind him is a mountain range and a number of locks. So it's an ideal habitat for, seeing. And luckily now there are places that they can make the report to. That wasn't really possible up to about 5 years ago. We would have had to get in touch with somebody in America to make a report of a hominid-type creature.
Well, that, and it does make sense. They do the same thing here in the U.S. I mean, it just makes sense that they I wouldn't say they're migratory like migratory birds, but they do follow the food sources. So in the summertime, they're going to be at the lower elevations, and then when the winter comes on, it's the other way around. In the wintertime, they come down to the lower elevations, and in the summertime, they go to the higher elevations. And so that would make total sense. Now, this sighting that was in Scotland, that would be, I'm thinking where the locks are, that'd be kind of like maybe Western Scotland, or?
Yes, it was. It was on the west coast of Scotland, very close to the coast. So you doubled your food sources instantly there. So this creature probably would have been moving between the mountain range and the coast. Every single seaweed in the UK is edible. And then obviously all of the other protein sources that come along with the coast. And as I say, he's out there on his own, so it's just this little, what they call a croft, so like a small stone cabin. That's where he lives. He was gathering wood for the night, for the fire. Clocks had just gone back, so it would be dark much earlier. So he just said that he heard the gate go, and that really stunned him because he couldn't understand, because only the farmer ever came up there, and he would have to come. When he comes in a vehicle. So he went up to the top of the hill to get a good look at what it was, and he said as it was walking away, he couldn't put a name to it. It was about 8 feet tall. It was very broad across the shoulders, very slim at the hips, had long arms that came down past its side, and it walked away from him and didn't look back. It didn't turn and look back until it was quite far away from him, and then it did. And he said at that point it just kind of turned its body and looked back at him, as if to let me know that it had seen me. So it kind of turned as if to say, I know that you're there, kind of thing. And he just went back in the house because he's got small children. And he doesn't really want any more to do with it other than that. So what I've done is I've contacted an investigator that's not near the area, but is prepared to travel in. And I've just asked him to go down there when we're off restrictions. If he could go down there and just have a look around for me and have a bit of an area check and see what food sources we've got going on and kind of habitat.
Yeah, that's interesting. Have they been sighted further up? I'm just curious. You go a little further up, and then you got the islands. You got the Shetland Islands, and I think there's some islands to the west.
I know what you're saying. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump into you then. There isn't reports on the islands themselves, but I have a report from somebody on the island looking onto the mainland, and they saw something. But what you're looking across a bay. So there are no bears here in the UK, and there haven't been for about 200 years. And he describes what he thought were 2 bears standing upright on 2 legs, and they were watching him across the water. And then we've got one quite far up. I'm just clicking on my map so I can get the right details for you. Yeah, it's in a place called Larrig. It's Larig. And if you keep going, you end up at John O'Groats, and many people know that. It's the very tip of England. And we have a report from the Kirkwall Islands, somebody looking across at John O'Groats, who has said, and he says that he sees these 2 upright bears that look like they're looking for clams on the beach. So you could times that by, that sounds very similar to Washington. It sounds very similar to Alaska, same kind of behaviour on the coast looking for food. And then as we come further down, I think you need a person to see the Sasquatch to make the report. So as we come further down to like Inverness and places like that, the Battle of Culloden area, you get more and more reports, and they come in from the poachers. And they'll say that they're taking fish from the nets, they're taking deer, they're taking, basically they're waiting for the poacher to do what they're doing. And very strange, they're taking the innards. So they'll say like, well, we catch the deer, we skin it, we set the pluck, and then that pluck is gone the next day. So they seem very interested in the liver and the fatty organs for some reason. That pops up quite often. I'm not sure if that's the same in America.
It's exactly the same.
Right.
And that's something that we've talked about. We just speculated that maybe there's a higher protein source or caloric source, in the internal organs and that sort of thing. So that's interesting that they are on the beaches, and we have reports of Bob Titmus saw the same thing in British Columbia, and there are reports in Alaska, and I think even in the state of Washington where they dig around for clams and whatever they can find, I would assume, the tidal range.
Yeah, I wondered if salt had anything to do with it as well. I mean, I know it sounds like a way out there question, but us mammals, we need salt. And I wondered if the draw to the coast, because lots and lots of the reports in the UK are around the coastal areas, was it that when you're eating the seafood, you're taking in necessary minerals and salt into your diet, and maybe that meant for a better diet. So I thought, well, I need to look between the mountains and the coast and see what reports we have. And they seem to be following the rivers. And I think the estuaries, there's a massive food source. So if you follow that estuary inland by the river, you're finding different foods and different resources all the way in until you get to the mountains. So are the mountains the areas where that's kind of the long-term area? And what we're seeing is them as they're moving back and forwards, and we're out and about doing our things, and we get an eye of them. That's kind of just something that the map's kind of showing me. The rivers are incredibly important for some reason.
Mind if I jump in for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
First thing, well, Renee DeHenden used to speculate. He'd tell me that he felt, especially in the wintertime, when a lot of the beaches on the west coast here of North America were essentially deserted by people because of weather and things, that these creatures would come down, and that's what they would look for, was clams and things like that along the beach. I don't know if he ever found any evidence of that, but that was his speculation. But the rivers are very important. They will follow those because they're also where the game animals are and other food sources, so that's very important to them.
Yeah. I'd noticed a difference between England and Ireland. As some people know, the UK is made up of 4 countries. So you've got England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And on the main island, you have England, Wales and Scotland. And we have around, I think it's between 45 and 60 estuaries. And we have a lot of reports around those estuaries. If you go to Ireland itself, the Emerald Isle, there are only 5 estuaries. And the sighting reports are minimal, very minimal. There's less than 10 in the entire island. And most of those reports are around one large loch on the northeast coast. And it would seem that even in Ireland, they are sticking to the main water sources because there are no reports inland at all. They're all around these water sources along the coast and next to the loch. So I think that's to do with there are so many water sources in England and there are just none. It's very 5 estuaries is nothing for one island. I think they're sticking to where there are resources, in all honesty.
One of the things I wanted to address also, you mentioned, it was a good point about salt and minerals. I found places here in Northern California where we know that, other higher primates will on occasion eat clay. And other animals do the same thing, to get that mineral content that they need. And I found places where these creatures have done it too, very long finger drag marks. in fresh clay where they've done that. So absolutely, they will be looking for those minerals.
It makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, when we were back in the caveman days, most of our food would have dirt on it anyway, and we would eat it, and we didn't come to any harm. I think it's just we live in such a sterilised world now. We forget that.
It's very artificial, the creation of our world.
Yeah, and I think people struggle with the question of food sources because I think you're thinking with a modern man brain, we think about flavour and taste, and I don't think they do. I think for them it's about minerals, nutrients, calorific value, and just getting your food groups. I think water, food and shelter is probably their main thing that they do consistently all the time. As humans are very,
absolutely,
we've lost that. So we don't think about food in a calorific value or what good it would do for us. And early man, it was very rare that they got a large animal. Most of the diet's made up from kind of grubs and shrubs and flies and butterflies, and we don't like to think like that, but that's how we ate, you know?
I just watched a video about that very thing where they talked about early humans. What made us so successful is because, number one, you're correct, they didn't often get large animals, so they supplemented their diets with pretty much anything. Today we'd think, oh, that's really gross, but it's what made humans very successful as a species. There's one other thing I wanted to bring up too that I know our listeners are gonna talk about, and I've seen it written before by people. They say, well, Bigfoot in the UK, how can that be? It's an island. Well, we have to remember things like humans have swam the English Channel numerous times. So if a human can do it, and the Sasquatch is a much better swimmer than humans, they do it all over the place here in this part of the world. So, and then of course Europe had, especially, and I think my reference is what I saw. I think it was France, and I don't remember when it was. I want to say the 1600s, maybe previous to that. You mentioned the woodwose. In that part of the world, it was very common back in those days that practically everything was adorned with carvings of the woodwose. It was very, very prominent.
The first carving I found of an actual woodwose was 429 BC, and that was in an area around Italy.
Wow.
And there's a very early cave painting in Europe, and that's the first one where you see a human and an animal combined, so almost a hybrid, and that's a very early cave painting. I started looking into, because when you're a witness, for some strange reason, people think that you have all of the answers. So I'd come forward and I'd say, I saw this in the UK, and they'd say, well, you can't have done. Where does it eat? Where does it sleep? How do they have babies? Similar question, there's not enough land, all of those things. And for some reason, I'm supposed to have those answers, and I never did in the beginning. So I thought, well, I need to learn them, don't I? I need to learn what's happening in other parts of the world and what's different about the UK and what's going on. So I've kind of lost my thread. Sorry. What was the question? Sorry about that.
Oh, no, we're talking about, how they could be in the UK, and I think that's a fairly straightforward answer, is they're very good, very accomplished swimmers. And
we used to be connected to Europe as well. There was the Bering Sea Bridge. Yeah, so we've got that. Early man got here. So, we managed somehow to get here. We didn't just appear on England. And there are some finds of hominids, probably. I don't know my dates of hominids, I'm terrible. But we used to have a Heidelbergensis in the UK. So we had other hominids other than our modern man here. And I just think, even our country's named for its giants. It's called Albion. The real name of England is Albion, and it's named for Albina. And she came to England and mated with her giants. Caesar wrote about the giants of England. Pliny did. He didn't write it himself. Pliny wrote it for him. And he said that they were men that could disappear within the trees and vanish again at will. Because England was just one huge forest, that going back to that day. And it throughout our history, there is consistent written language. Even in our stories, we celebrate the Green Man. He's in our history. Many of our early religions were based around him, and he's this caretaker of the woods. he looks like an animal and a man. And we even have very early, what we would now call bluff charges. Back then, these gorillas and apes that would run out and chase people from the wood and steal maidens. And the very first written report in the UK comes from Scotland. And that was written by the Gauls, and that was in the 6th century. And they talk about the satyrs, or the man-monkey of Scotland. And the only thing it feared was fire. And as the Gauls were trying to take over Scotland, these 8 men were pushing them further and further back. And in the end, the Gauls ran back to Birmingham and said, we can't take over that part of the country because of these satyrs, these man-monkeys. And that's written within our history. But we're not taught it.
Where would somebody, if they wanted to look into that, and then I had another question about the North Sea, but do you know if there's online references? Because that is absolutely fascinating, because everything that you just mentioned, man monkeys that disappear into the trees, that's these things entirely, right?
That is them to a T, isn't it? It's
sure is.
Yeah, we also call them dryads. The word druid comes from dryads, and that's the tree men. And they thought that they were spirits. They were so combined with nature that they must have been early spirits or something like that. And I think maybe they've been here just as long as us. I'm just actually pulling up the reference where I got the Gaul one from, because people want to hear about that.
I'd like to include that when we publish this. And real quick, while you're bringing that up, I saw a documentary that at one time, and this supports easy migration from Europe to the United Kingdom or to England, that the North Sea was actually above sea level. It was actually just kind of a marshy land where you could go out and forage and have houses and huts and that sort of thing. Are you familiar with that? Yes.
And one of the other questions we have to answer is, if they're in America and Russia and they're in England, they've got to be within the countries between them. So we have to start looking at reports across Europe. And they're there. So you've got them in Sweden. I don't think people are aware of that. You've got them in Finland, around the Baltic states, all across. And then you think about the cave systems. There are actual cave systems that run from the UK all underneath Europe. And we could suggest that they are moving subterraneously. I mean, we don't know. We've not mapped all of the cave systems. And then you've got the forests. There are huge, vast forests across Europe. And there's more understanding of being in Europe because there's no sea bridge like there is with the UK. The descriptions are the same, the habitats are the same, the behaviours are the same, and they call him the wild man too. The Lesher, Vanara, Puka, they all have a name for it, but it's the same typical 7-foot hairy, ape-like man that lives in the wood. The reference for the Gauls is the history of ancient Caledonia, because that was the name of Scotland back then.
Right.
And it's let's get it up. 1879 it was written. The History of Ancient Caledonia by John McLaren. And I can give you the link to that because I've popped the link of it onto my map. The map's free, and if anybody wants to access it, just let me know and I'll send you the link. It's every sighting report that I've ever taken is on that map. Even the American ones and Canada. So there's some really interesting stories on there. You click on the little picture and the icon, the story will open up for you and you can read it. And if there's any evidence finds, I'll attach them to it as well. So it's just a good source for people if they want to go out to the areas or, they want to go looking for themselves.
Yes, and we'll post that on creekdevil.com, our website, and we also want to put the links on our YouTube channel.
Yeah, that's fine.
And I want to talk about the mythologies for just a moment. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is true, and I realize what I'm about to ask is more of an Irish mythology, but I had heard in something completely unrelated to our topic that actually the Irish were taught that leprechauns originally were not these little guys that, wore a little suit and a top hat, but were very large.
And hairy and awful. And there's a Celtic name and it begins with G, and I can't pronounce it because it's in Old Gaelic. And it's the thing that you're describing. The typical leprechaun back then was not your Hollywood little green man who you found a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. He was an awful thing that would come and steal your children and make your animals go sick. And they would leave things out for them like milk and honey and hay and things like that. And it's the same in England. We just have a different name. They're called boggarts or buggers.
Well, that's funny. Okay, and I'm going to back up again because you called them wood boogers. And here in America, down in the South, they're not referred to so much as Bigfoot or Sasquatch. They call them boogers and wood boogers.
Right.
Now, isn't that interesting? It's almost as if, well, not almost, I would suspect that they brought that name over with them from England.
Yeah, very possibly, I would imagine. It's bugger is a name that we use, and some people it's a swear word, but we use it for everything. You even say to the child, "Oh, you little bugger," and it's something that's mischievous and in a kind of evil sort of way, not something you want to cross. And sometimes they call the Pictish brown boys because the original Brits, the Picts, were
Picts, right?
Yeah, that's what we were called, the Picts back then. They had this story of this brown boy that lived within the woods. And, he'd steal things from you and you couldn't leave your children because he'd take them. So all the typical tales that you get all across the world. And it fascinates me because these tales are from when we did communicate globally. So you've got a little crofting island that has the same kind of story as someone in Canada maybe 1,000 years ago. And we're all still talking about it to this day. So they have to be in every country of the world because the stories of them are. It absolutely fascinates me.
Oh, it is. And we've talked about that, the repeatability of data where you see behaviors, reported and recorded that are identical. And so it's fascinating, everything you're talking about in England, where you're having these boogers or woodburrows, absolutely parallels in North America, both in the States and in Canada and Alaska.
There's another feature as well, and that's the two main groupings. And just for, we don't have to go into all that, but there are people like John Napier and Ivan Sanderson and some of the others talked about there being two versions of these things, two types. And we do know that there are two different kinds. So when you talk about, the Patterson type and then there's this other type, we have the same thing in Australia and virtually everywhere in the world. The Yeti, there are two versions. So it's across the board and across time and space as well.
It is. I mean, this week alone, I've taken a report from New Zealand. I've taken one from Connecticut, and that was because of the wood bugger thing that I put out, because that witness described them as almost sloth-like in the face. A lady got in touch with me from Connecticut and said, I saw that in 1981, and it was stood upright, and it had this kind of sloth thing. I've had one from Indonesia, and I've actually had one from Africa, and what they call the strange black apes, and that's just in the last 10 days alone. So these stories are coming in from all across the globe. And there's only me. I mean, I can't investigate all of them. So what I tend to do is I'll try and find somebody in that country that has this interest and is prepared to run with it. And I'll ask them if they'll speak to the witness and kind of take the case on for me and kind of do it like that. Because they are coming in from all over the world. And I think people have this knowledge that they're just in America or they're just in America and Canada. I haven't found a country yet where there isn't some form of report of them. The Mapinguari, just wherever you go, you stick a pin in that map and there'll be a report of an upright, hairy thing that lives in the wood. You'll probably steal your baby, take food, mess with your horses, all of the same similar things that you hear, plaiting horses' tails. It just happens all across the world. It's really strange.
Can we back up a little bit? I'm really curious about the reports that you've heard in Africa. You sound like you had a recent one. What are and what did they call it? The black ape?
The strange black ape. She said that they're not like a native ape. Like they're more like basically the way she described it to me was like a human and an ape combined. And she said they had this trick, and this is what stayed with me. They would drop down from the tree very quickly, grab, say, like an impala, put the hand under the chin, pull the neck back, and then disappear into the long grass and gone. And she even described that motion that you hear of where they drop to the belly and they crawl like a commando. And
really?
Yes, and so I've taken that. That's come up in so many reports that I've taken. And I, unfortunately, I haven't been able to really speak to her. I've not spoken to her on Skype or anything like that. So I've just got the original sighting report as it came in. But that behaviour, she said, she suddenly you get this feeling that you're being watched. And they're almost tribe-like. But the people around there are so used to them that they just call them. And she said it was it's South Africa that was speaking. It was an Afrikaans word that she called them. And it just meant like the human ape. And she said that they had this habit if they would be up in the trees and they would drop down to get the animal that they wanted, and then they would just kind of belly crawl out of there. And that was kind of stuck in my mind because I thought, oh, I've heard of that from Edmonton all across the United States.
Oh, absolutely. You're exactly right about that.
Yeah. It's just such a creepy thing for me that they can be upright on 2 feet when within a millisecond they're down on the floor and they're moving. They're so fluid, and the way that people describe the way that they move, this fluid movement.
Well, and I wonder if so many people describe when they're in the vicinity of these creatures, they didn't see anything, but they heard a loud thump, like somebody dropped an engine block on the ground.
On the ground, this huge thud. Yeah.
Yes, and if you're looking around, this thing could be down in the grass or the ferns. Speaking of creepy, I want to go into something that's a little bit gruesome, but it has been reported in both the United States and largely in Canada, the west coast of British Columbia, and going all the way back to early 1800s, maybe earlier. And there's a phenomenon where, and it's happening to this day, where foots will wash ashore, where somebody's foot has washed ashore, and the shoe or boot oftentimes is still on the foot. Yes. And the foot was dismembered without the use of tools. It was snapped. Are there any similar reports in the United Kingdom on that?
Yes, there's one close to me. Where I live, as I said, it's not, now it's quite urban 30 years on, but back then it was less urban. And there's a river valley that runs through it, and it takes off. It goes all the way up the Pennines, which is the mountain range, and off up to Scotland. And there's a river course that runs through it. And all of the sighting reports in my area are along this river course. And we have one lady's foot that's within a shoe, and the police have said that there's no suspicious circumstances at all. And there's another case in the New Forest, which is down south in England, a massive forest, and they still farm there like they did, very like the Amish. They still farm in a traditional way. So it's just a beautiful place. And within about 500 yards of a cryptid sighting, we have this shoe with a foot in it, a male foot that's in it, within the sock. And there's no...
Yes.
It's not been cut or sawn or anything like that. And we have no idea how it got there. They're the only two that I know about, but they could be out there and I just don't know about them.
No, that's very interesting too, because again, you talk about dismembering without the use of tools. So that means something had to snap. I just really challenge somebody to take a cow bone, okay, yes, and give it a snap, and good luck with that. And there was a story that I heard actually just a few days ago about a gentleman who was an outdoorsman. He was very avid and very familiar with the outdoors, and he got lost. And long story short, when they found him, his feet were missing.
Wow.
So there's some parallels there.
I've had a number of cases. I'm not sure if you have any I've had them hit in Brazil more than anything. People who are completely drained of blood. No blood within the bodies, no wounds on them or anything like that. And there's just there's one place in Brazil where there's a number of these killings that are males, and they completely not one drop of blood within the body. And I've never been able to find anything in the newspapers or anything really. But I just find it incredibly strange that there are no cryptid sightings in the area. So I'm not saying that it's cryptids that are doing this. I'm just saying it's very strange that you're finding human males that are
absolutely strange.
Blood. Yeah, very strange.
Very, very, and very, very unnerving. Going back just momentarily for the feet, the two that you had mentioned that were there in the UK, were they near waterways that you're aware of?
Yes, both of them. Both of them were on the river course, so within the floodplain of the river.
Interesting. That's exactly the same here in both in Canada and the U.S. Because what we think happens is they snap the foot off, throw it in a creek or a river, and it washes and washes and ends up either getting into the ocean or what we call the Puget Sound.
Yes.
And then up onto the beaches and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's got to wash up somewhere, hasn't it? And it's normally a place. I think that the river floats them in, and there they are. I mean, and honestly, in the UK, they could be out there, and we just don't know. The Americans tend to use their leisure time outdoors far more than people in the UK. We don't have a huge hunting culture. People fish, but they don't take the fish home. They throw them back in. So we have a very different outlook to being out. I would say 8 out of 10 Brits don't leave the path. So they stay on the path, even when they're out in the countryside and things like that. So they could be popping up and we just wouldn't know. We could ask under the Freedom of Information Act. And if we ask correctly, we might get a few answers on whether any of police know of any reports like that or something like that. There's something I can do. But trying to get the police to answer is another thing. We have an area in Staffordshire where there have been 40 wolf reports and 12 upright werewolf reports. And you'd think that would be in every paper in the UK. And we've actually got the government statistic. I've got it. And it says it names them all. And the government refused to admit that's going on. There are 15,000 cat reports, so like mountain lion, puma, leopard. 3 DNA.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah.
3 DNA samples that have come back. 1 was lion and 2 were leopard. And our government will tell you there are no large cats in the UK. And I don't go a week without getting a report of a large cat. And the habitat's changing. The habits are changing. 30 years ago, it was people out in the wilds that saw them. So like in the mountains of Scotland or Wales, places like that. Then about 15 years ago, it'd be farmers. So they're coming further inland. Now it's dog walkers on the trails. So they're either running out of space because they're breeding, or they're getting really close to humans because they're losing a fear of us. And I've seen that pattern change. And what worries me is you know yourself, a cat will slink off. 9 times out of 10, they're out there and you don't know. But these are kind of standing off with dog walkers, so as if they're not seeing the fear in the human, I don't think. I just think that at some point there's going to be a problem.
Well, that's a really good point. And that applies to this creature as well. Mm-hmm. And we've said this time and again that, and we know it to be true, that you can be within 30 feet of this creature and you never know it, because largely they just stand perfectly still and they're absolutely expert at utilizing shadows and hiding in the shadows.
I can tell you I had one 2 feet behind me and didn't know it was there.
In the UK, you've heard me mention the green man, and it's a face that's hiding within the leaves. And we've always had it. It's on our shields, it's in our churches, it's everywhere. and it's this hidden face within the leaves. And that's kind of like what I saw, this hidden face within the leaves that leant out. And I've took a number of reports over the years where they speak of them using the foliage and the shadow to hide the faces. So even when you're getting full-on face-to-face reports, they'll say like, oh, well, the sun was behind it, I couldn't see its face, it was in shadow. Or it was using the leaves or the trees or the grass to kind of mask its face, and it was when I noticed the movement that I saw it. That's kind of what happened with me. It could have been stood there the entire time I was there, and I didn't know. And that's terrifying.
I think they do. No, I'm certain they do. I had an incident, it was a year ago, and I was probably 15 feet from one of these things, and I didn't know it until sometime later. And they're absolutely silent. They're really adept at hiding. So and concealment. That's the world they live in.
Masters of their environment.
Yes, they are.
Of the environment, aren't they? They that's their, I don't know what the right word is. They're in their perfect place. They can move around us and we haven't got a clue. We've got FLIR images in England where you can see them moving around on the FLIR, but you can't figure out. The woman who took it couldn't see them with their own eyes, in perfect daylight.
Yeah, no, they're masters of cover and concealment. When you and I spoke the other day, you said you and your husband do something, and I just really thought it was really cool. And that is, you invite people to have like a little campfire, and you have some tea, and you just sit around and talk.
Yes, yeah, we do. And it started because obviously as I met other people, I mean, you know yourself, you said when you speak to somebody else that's experienced the same as you, you're almost finishing each of the sentences and you think, oh, finally, somebody who doesn't think I'm a complete crackpot. And I'd noticed that I thought, why am I not getting these people together? Because that's what they need. They need to be talking to each other. Because when you see something like that, especially on an island where they're not supposed to be, sometimes it can have a bit of an effect on your mental health. You can lose friends, people, and they give you the side eye. So I started getting them together. So we just turn up, say, right, we're going to be in Cannock Chase, say, in a month's time. And my husband gets a little fire going and we get a brew on and we just say to people, oh, bring your own cup and a chair and just come out. And we kind of have like I'll say, my name's Debbie, and, in 1982, this is what happened to me. But I also take all of the sighting reports that are in that area down there with me, so that when I'm there, I can say to them, right, well, off to the north, this happened in 91, and off to the south, and I do that with them. And then you just see them talk to each other, and they kind of blossom, in all honesty. They open up in front of you. And then they start speaking about the other things, because I've never found a witness that hasn't had some kind of other strange experience in their life, either with UFO or paranormal or something along those lines. And we just keep doing it. We just go from town to town, and it's got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But what it's also enabled me to do is I now have a network of investigators, volunteer investigators, all across the UK. So when a report comes in, I can instantly give it to somebody that's in that town, that's probably had an experience herself, and can say to the witness, well, I had a similar experience, 7 miles down the road 10 years ago. Much easier for them. Then they can take the report from me and they liaise with the witness. So we started it about 10 years ago, this meeting people. And we were just about to have a huge conference where anybody could come from across the country and stay with us for the day. And we were going to do a camp out in the Highlands of Scotland for 3 days over the weekend, and anyone could come out and join us. They're still booked, and they will still go ahead once the lockdown's off. And anybody can come. You don't have to have experiences. You don't have to, just come. If you want to come out and join us, if you just have an interest in the subject, just come out for the day and have a cup of tea and see how you feel. And if you don't like it, you can always go. Go back home again. What have you got to lose?
Well, and you know what it does is you create a little bit of a kind of a groundswell, grassroots.
Yeah.
And I think here in America, I think a very similar thing happened just with people like John Green, Renee DeHinden, what Will's done, and Bob Titmus. There's a lot of pioneers, and then they build this foundation, and they continue to build on it, and then that builds, and over time, and then of course with the internet and information sharing, it's even more so. So now you've got. I guess that's just kind of an encouragement to the people in the United Kingdom that, it's just going to grow and grow. And once you get your witnesses coming forward and saying, I saw that face too. Exactly. And then you start looking at your history, the Green Man, the Woodrose, all of that stuff. And then you have it in Europe. People start connecting the dots.
We've been very lucky that we've been able to set. We've got a number of Americans now that have joined the community. It's free. You don't have to pay. And once a month, what I do is I send an email around. So any new sighting reports that have come in, I send an email around to everybody. So if they want to go and investigate that case, we can. So we've got members in Australia. We've got them all across Europe. So it's really opening up to be a big thing because I think people have a genuine interest in the subject. And as you said, there have been some pioneers, and the information that they come up with should not become obsolete. We need to soak that up like a sponge and then give it to the next generation because we don't want it lost. I mean, the hours of field work that's gone in and yourself, it's trial and error, isn't it? So there's so much work goes into what we do. You want to be able to pass that on to somebody so they can use it for their benefit further down the line, And I just think that's just one way of doing it. And sharing is I think people just really enjoy it because they can talk about subjects that they have a real understanding of and they don't get the side eye. They don't get that, Bigfoot thing that you get. They go, I'm into that subject. What do you think about this theory? Or what do you think about, how do you think one of the things that always comes up is the hair, isn't it? Is the hair prismatic? Does it reflect back? Is there something about the hair that makes it's so easy for them to hide? It's just, you get people talking on subjects like that. They might actually come up with an answer. Yeah.
Well, and you talk about the skeptics, where they're starting to become, I think they're becoming more and more marginalized. And there's a guy from the UK that I really like to listen to. He doesn't talk about this subject, but he was part of the MOD, Nick Pope, and he had a quote, and he was talking about the skeptics, and it was actually a topic that, as fascinating as it is, it's not the one that we focus on, but it's about the UFOs. Mm-hmm. And he basically said the skeptics have to be right 100% of the time, but the believers only have to be right once.
That is it in a nutshell, isn't it? And honestly, skepticism is great because you need it. You need to debunk some things. Not everything you see is difficult, and we need that. But then I found I would butt heads quite often in the early days with people who would just sit in an armchair at home and they were never out in the field. They weren't doing anything, and they would just say to me, "No," and I would say, "But you hadn't even looked. I'm just trying to show you all this evidence. You have no interest in it." And I realised that even if I dragged one of them kicking and screaming into the forest and shown them the wild folk, they still wouldn't believe me. They'd accuse me of hoaxing. So I just decided that I wasn't going to spend any more time on them. If they've made their mind up that there's nothing out there, then there's no conversation I can have with them that's going to change that. Well,
you're exactly right. There are people that are they're closed channel, closed minded, and no matter what. And I think there's a couple of reasons. And I think you refer to them as debunkers and scoffers and that sort of thing. Yeah. I think they get some sort of payment out of debunking. It allows them to be kind of on top of the situation. But I've watched them, and I'm thinking, okay, you're exactly right. They sit in the chairs. They're not objective. They don't weigh the evidence. They just sit there and debunk, and they go, well, I realize that I wasn't there, but let me tell you what you really saw.
Well, they're not really thinking. See, it's so unacceptable to their way of thinking, they simply won't allow it.
The amount of times that I've been told by somebody else in another country that wasn't stood with me that day that I didn't see what I saw, and to be honest, it's hysterical because you weren't standing there next to me. That is as ludicrous as me telling somebody in Alaska that there are no such thing as wolves. You know, I just think you can't do that. And what right do I have to do that to somebody else, you know?
Well, you're exactly, that's a good way to put it. They don't have a right.
You were not there, standing in my shoes.
Yes.
One thing I say often is, I am obsessed with this subject. I eat, sleep, and live it. And you don't do that for 40 years for nothing. My family have had to live with this. My girls have grown up with it. My husband knows the subject in and out and could probably do the same talk as me because it shaped my life. It was so life-changing, and you will hear the others say that. There's before the event and then there's after the event. Yeah,
that's exactly right. And you know, it's interesting when these people who have had no experience, they want to come in and basically it's like being called a liar. Okay, they're telling you that, and I've said that you know, I've got 2 words for them, and they're not thank you. Just leave it at that.
They just, for me, it's even harder, I think, because I wasn't in a country that accepts that there are these creatures. And probably in the 80s in England, probably the only place I could go was the library. There wasn't anything. And I cottoned onto long-wave radio, and I thought, right, I'm just going to get on there, because Dad used to do it, and you know, like CB radio. So I start asking truckers. So you've got this 17, 18-year-old girl that's asking people who drive the road if they've seen anything strange, because I'm thinking, they're out at night, all night, they're driving the roads, they're going through these places. And I was amazed that I'd get these reports back. And I just thought, what else can I try? So it was like M&M and MySpace, and then Skype came along, and I was amazed at the wealth of knowledge that was out there on the subject. So I don't think you put that much effort in if you're lying. And
you know, that's actually a really good point.
You know,
if you just scratch the surface.
Yeah, I could just say, right, well, I was out in the middle of Scotland, in the middle of nowhere, and I saw this typical Sasquatch shape, and away it went. I could have just done that, you know? Why would I make it really hard for myself and say I saw it in a flipping mill town in the northwest of England? I can't change what happened to me. It doesn't matter what somebody else thinks of me. I can't change that. There's nothing I can do about that. All I can be is happy with myself. And I'm at a level now where I saw what I saw, and it doesn't matter if you don't believe me. What I'm interested in is the people out there who have also seen it, who think they're on their own, and they think that they're going crackers maybe, or they're thinking, did that really happen that day? Did I really see that? Was I hallucinating? All the questions that we ask ourselves, there's somebody out there on their own asking themselves that question. And that's what makes me open my laptop every day. Because there will be a message, an email, a Skype message where they said, look, I know you don't know me, but I'm reaching out to you because. And then that just starts to circle again. You know, and I'm sure it's the same for you guys. Because people know they can approach you.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that are, oh my gosh, I would have to say, well, isn't it just so many of the guests that we have afterwards will tell us they're so grateful that they were able to not only share their experience, but share it with somebody. They didn't have that hurdle of disbelief, of incredulity to get beyond. They were talking to peers,
and it's very therapeutic for them to talk about it, to get it out of their system.
It is. I mean, I have a favour to ask you guys. I have a gentleman called Randy, and he lives, as I say, he's a witness from Slave Lake. And he saw something at Slave Lake, and he also saw something in Edmonton when he was hunting with his sons. And I was the only person that would take his report seriously. And we're great friends now, and we've been great friends for a while. And I always say to him, when I can find somebody in America that will sit down and speak to you, I'm going to put them in touch with you, Randy. This guy's a bear guide. He's out there day in, day out. He hunts his own food. That's the way he lives. That's his life. So he has this Sasquatch experience, and then he suddenly starts thinking about all the strange experiences he's had when he's been hunting out in the wilds.
Yeah, we'd love to talk to him.
There's an occasion where he shot a deer, and he said the grass was about 5 foot high. Shot the deer went down, walked over to it, the deer was nowhere, it was gone. He said, I walked the field in a grid, didn't find the body, didn't find blood on the ground, didn't run off, I saw it drop. He said, I stood in the middle where the deer should be, and I worked myself out in a spiral, still couldn't find it. I said, were you scared? He said, no, I was annoyed. I wanted the meat. The meat, no, I wasn't scared. I was really annoyed. He said, I even went home, got my buddy and brought my buddy back with me. And that deer was nowhere. And he said, I never put the two incidents together until he saw a Sasquatch take down a moose. And he's in the wilds of Canada. And if you're going to see that anywhere, that's where you're going to see it. And he also saw something with his boys. And he said to me, I thought it was a bear because it was that colour, that dark black colour coming over the crest. He said, and I realised it wasn't swinging its head. And bears swing their heads when they walk, they smell the air continuously. And it wasn't doing that. It was walking up like a man. He said, and when it saw me and the children, it turned on a dime, which I presume means quickly, went towards a tree, went behind the tree, and started peeping out at us from the tree. Well, if that's not Sasquatch behaviour, I don't know what is. And nobody in
it's not bear. Yeah, it's absolutely not bear behavior.
We'll lose that story if we don't take that story in chronologically, get it down. We're going to lose it. And then I bet there are so many details in it that you and Will pick up on. I'm not an American. I don't know how to hunt. I don't know any of that. And I just think he needs to speak to somebody like you and Will.
Well, if you're still in contact with him,
yes.
Absolutely, please have him get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to him. Mm-hmm. But going back to having the deer, his game being stolen. Mm-hmm. Well, have we ever heard that before?
Yeah, just a time or two.
I know we've shared the story before, but there's the guys that poach the deer, and then can you tell that story?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was interesting because, and I've told this before, the guy was a former Hell's Angel, and I knew that because I saw newspaper articles about the guy. And he also coincidentally played guitar for Johnny Mathis, so he sort of had a dual personality. But he was a big guy, really big guy. And when I met him, he was quite a bit different than he was in his younger years. He was a very gentle man, at this point in his life. So he told me he had a couple of incidents, but the second one was interesting because he said he had his Jeep and another guy, they were up in southern Washington State, and they were poaching deer at night, which is very illegal. But, they were up there doing it, and they shot a deer, and they drove her on the switchback to get it, and when they got up there was snow on the ground, so the deer was gone. Now, this is just a couple of minutes after they shot it. The deer was gone, and they followed the blood trail because it had been dragged up the road, and when the spotlight or the lights on the Jeep came on this massive creature dragging the deer with the neck, they decided to just let the creature have the deer. They felt that was a better option.
Yeah, I'd be the same. I'd be okay. I'll go home and have an egg sandwich. We have reports in the UK, and I'm just going to ask you, have you ever heard of deer hung up in trees or deer legs?
Oh, I've got pictures of it.
Ah, right. Well, we get that often. Deer legs hung up in trees, entire deers hung up in trees, almost as if they, kind of dropped from above.
Do you have photographs of it?
Some of them, yeah. I've got some of them I can send to you. The deer legs, yeah, because I kept sending them all the time.
Right. We can send you a couple too, just so we can compare. And
some of them even have a twist to the leg.
Oh, yeah. We interviewed a guy who actually witnessed a group of these things hunting deer, and it wasn't a time the deer was right in front of him, and the thing grabbed it, and it broke its legs or twisted its legs and left it there and went chasing after the other ones, and it came back for the live one.
Yes. Yeah. And he was absolutely shocked.
I would be too.
So
I've stood in front of one of these things. I can imagine, watching it kill something. Thankfully, it didn't get me.
I had a scary experience with a deer leg, and that was in Scotland. We were up in the wilds of Scotland, so you can imagine it's about 4:30 in the morning. We're in thick pine forest. You can't see your hand in front of your face. And even with the head torch on, you could just see a round circle on the ground. It was that dark. And as we walked in, there were a number of bones at the side of the deer fence. Bleached, old bones, kind of sat out in a bit of a strange pattern, and I noticed that when we were going in. And as we were walking in, we'd gone in quite far, and we found a deer, it was a sheep head, completely bleached, an old bone that was there. And we found this pattern consistently. And what I was looking for, I knew that there'd be one area of the forest where a number of the trees had been pushed down, kind of blocking a path. And I'm not incredibly mobile. So when I found that, I said to the gentleman I was with, can you walk this trail now? And it should be blocked off again at some point with these felled trees. And we found that. And I said to him, right, we're in the right area. This is where we need to be looking. So we just went lights out and sat there quiet. And unfortunately, one of the guys that was on the trip with us started wood banging on the trees. And I knew it was over and done with it at that point. So I said, we might as well go. It doesn't matter. Let's go. And as we walk out, the original pile of bones that was next to the fence, there is a brand spanking deer leg there, snapped, still fresh, with blood, skin, hair, no smell to it. It was as fresh as a daisy, and it was lay on top of that pile of bones. And it completely creeped me out, and I thought we were circumvented. As we walked in there, something walked behind us. And that's what stuck in my mind, and I didn't want to go back into the forest. I just thought, no, not this area. No, not. Well, it was awful.
No, I understand that 1,000%. And we have at least, we have one of our guys that we are in contact quite frequently who found, his name's Dalton, and he's an elk hunter here in Oregon, and he found a pile of bones. I think they were jaw bones from elk. But the thing that was interesting was they were arranged in a kind of an arrangement, and they're all different ages.
Wow. Just jaw bones.
Wow.
And he's also found salmon in trees.
That's very strange. I've had octopus and fish in trees and never been able to work out how. Maybe it's a stashing system. Maybe it's, squirrels dry mushroom in trees. Maybe it's a way of preserving food. I'm not sure.
Maybe we were thinking it was more like a kind of a, I don't know what, like a baiting situation.
Well, and that's like with deer in the trees. You could go, and it takes quite a bit. It's a mathematical equation. You have to think about, how many calories you're expending versus what you're taking in.
Yeah.
And the number taking in has to be higher than the other number. Yes. Otherwise, survival doesn't happen. So
exactly.
if you catch something like a deer or whatever and place it in a spot where it will attract other animals, then you're maximizing your caloric intake.
That's very... A vet got in touch with me when I was asking about the deer legs, and he said that male deer have a gland in the leg, and it's very odorous to other animals, and I wonder if that was why we were seeing these male deer legs in trees. Was it to draw other protein in?
That's a good point, because typically when you hunt deer, you want to remove those glands, otherwise it makes the meat gamey in taste.
So it could be, couldn't it? It could be a way of either drawing the does or just drawing in anything that's protein that's out there.
Absolutely.
I mean, we've certainly got the protein sources in the UK. We have deer, we have beaver, we have a terrible wild boar problem. They're a problem, so much so that they're on the free list. You can take them with the owner's permission. So there's enough protein moving around out there, and then you take in all your tubers and your mushrooms and your grubs and your eel and everything else that's out there. There is a smorgasbord of food if we just had the knowledge. You know, we only 150 years ago, we'd have been eating it ourselves before shops were open. I just think we don't realise how many resources there are. Every medicine in the world comes from the forest, doesn't it? We just worked out how to extract it, and, you know, aspirin comes from a willow and all of this, and heart medicine comes from bluebells, and they must have that knowledge, like a bear has a mental map of where every food resource is. It's got to be the same for them.
Yeah, I think they do. So a question I have that you brought up as kind of jogged my memory. Are there patches of areas in Britain where you have patches of wild berries?
Oh yes, yeah, most definitely. We could definitely forage. We have enough. I mean, I do quite a bit of foraging myself, just because I like it. That's my lifestyle. That's how we do it. So this is ideal foraging time at the moment. All the berries are out, your hazelnuts, your filberts, everything's out on the trees. And we'll have a good season for about 4, 5, 6 weeks. Apples, all the fruits out at this time of year. And this is a bumper time of the year for sightings. And I think it's just because there's so much food on the go. Winter will hit in about 6 weeks.
Right.
And then food sources kind of die out then till early spring. But even at the very earliest, as the snow melts, you've got all of your wild garlic coming through, this food coming through. Even the blackberries, for all there are none in spring, you can eat a brand new blackberry thing as it comes through. You can eat it. You can eat the green tip, and it's full of vitamin C. You've got wood sorrel. There's enough. There's certain people who live in the UK and they don't go to the shop. You know, the food's out there if you want to go and find it. There's crayfish, salmon, you know, we have freshwater fishes, trout, bream. You can think about it, it's out there. My grandparents would have caught fish and ate it for the dinner with the wild greens that they picked from the fields. You know, it's out there, but just people have lost the knowledge. And nettles, there's another one that just comes to the top of my head. Most of your weeds are edible. So if it's a weed and it's annoying and it's getting in your way, it's edible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Are you aware of any sightings of this creature that have been associated with either the berry patches or the berries?
I don't have any reports where they mention, not in England, I do in Alaska and Canada, where they mention picking of berries. I don't have that. But I do have reports where they're in the rivers or the streams and they're looking for something, this foot movement, where they're moving something with the foot in the water. We have a couple of reports like that in Wales, and some in England as well. But I can't think of I took about 1,400 reports, so I'd have to go back and off the top of my head, I can't think of any. Charmaine Fraser was in Scotland again, in forest land. She was about 8, and she was walking down the track, and you get your post at the bottom of the track as you do in America. So she was walking that length. The dog picked up on it first. The dog's hackles went up and started growling. And she said it was from behind, so she only saw him from behind. He was about 8 foot tall, and he had hold of the tree, and he was pulling it down as if he was examining the leaves at the end of the branch. And she just turned and run, she said, because I didn't want it to turn around and look at me. And she ran back up the farm track. And there were 2 other sightings on that land. And there was an occasion where they were picking raspberries, because Scotland's famous for its raspberries. And they heard that long, drawn-out howl, what we call the Ohio howl.
Oh, yeah.
And she said every one of the adults commented on it. And then there was one further occasion when they were driving back at night. Now, we're talking about a place where there's no street lights, there's no lights on the road, anything like that. They're driving up the road, and there's this black humanoid figure lit up in the moonlight as they're driving down the road, and it goes sideways back into the forest. And and there's a quarry there. If you were trying to pick an area to go and look for a Sasquatch, that's where you'd go. The river's decent, the forest is decent. There's just so many resources up there. And she was like me. She was 8 when it happened to her. She's in her 40s now. She's still doing that research, still trying to find the answer. She's going down the hominid line. So she's looking at anything that walks in the UK that was upright and bipedal to try and match it to the things that people are seeing.
You know, I find it interesting, the sounds, you know, the howls that they make, because that's something that we hear. You can go into, honestly, I think you can go into the Cascades at just about any time, especially in the summertime at nighttime, and you'll hear the, we call them scream barks and howls and grunts and noises that even people that don't believe in the creature know instantly this is nothing they've ever heard before.
Yeah. I'm an outside man. I'm always outside, and I've never heard anything like that before. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I heard it, Deborah. It roared like a lion. It went, whoo, and I could feel it inside. And we also get this mumbling, in speech. This just can't work out where. Yeah. Exactly the same.
Well, and it's interesting because I was talking to a guy last night about this. It's kind of the litmus test of authenticity of these creatures. Anybody, even somebody who doesn't believe in them, you get such a visceral response to like, what the heck was that? And I want to ask a couple questions about, you know, this little girl. You know, the thing was pulling a tree down, inspecting the limbs. Are there any reports that you've had of either people getting a mock charge where the thing charges up on them and turns around?
Yeah, bluff charges. It's the same. We call it the same as you do in America. We usually there's a smell. In not all cases, but in certain cases, there's this horrible smell that comes on, and the next thing, the bushes explode. You hear these spudding feet. Sometimes, at first, it's small stones that are thrown, and then the stones will get bigger. We've had instances where researchers have completely ignored every barrier and pushed on in to the point that they're getting stones hit into the face. And I said to them, but you've crossed a number of boundaries. You basically walked into somebody's bedroom. You've been screamed at. You've had things thrown at you, and you've carried on and you've pushed on in. Ordinary members of the public, I'm sure you'll recognise this when I say it. Usually off on an embankment or a steep embankment that's heavily wooded, and this thing keeps up with them as they walk, even though it's going through broken trees, brush.
Yeah, right. Yes.
And it keeps up with them at ease, sometimes on 2 feet and sometimes on 4. One man said, whatever it needed to do to keep going, to get out in front of me, that's what it did. And then it came down the embankment from the right-hand side. It went across the trail in front of me and down the left embankment. I don't know what it was, Deborah. It was as big as a horse, but it looked like an ape. And that story was over and over. I was walking and there was high-sided embankments. As I stepped, it stepped, and it kept up with me. And then it got, it always gets further in front of them onto the path. One guy said, I didn't know what to do because it was dark, and I knew that if I carried on walking the trail, I was going to converge with whatever it was. I don't know what it was because I didn't see it. But it shadowed me all the way along in the brush, and there's no way it could have done that, but it did. And then he talked about this growling snarl, and similar again, that you could feel it almost with a bass to it. I mean, I don't even know if it touches on infrasound. Some people talk about the knees almost going from underneath them, or they feel incredibly sick until they get away from the area. And that shadowing, dog walkers, people out on bikes, wild campers as we call them, people who just like to camp out wild. Lots and lots of situations of this shadowing behaviour, and they might not actually set eyes on any creature, and they'll say, like, it felt like the trees were watching me. And there's other instances where they will stop So the witness will stop suddenly and it'll get caught out. It'll take a number of other steps.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so
we've heard that a lot too.
Yeah.
Have you had any witnesses, any reports of, and this is something that I find interesting, Will had an experience like this where he was walking by, I think it was a bunch of blackberries, and they were violently shaking.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. No. And it growled.
Oh, do you mind telling me about it?
Oh, yeah. No, we used to have a trail between my house and a friend's house through the woods between our houses. That was the shortest point to go across. And so I'd go up a neighbor's driveway and then cut into the timber over to the trail. And the last time I used that trail, and I never used it again, I was walking along, there was a big patch of blackberry bushes along their driveway. And it was probably, 20, 30 feet across, and then the timber behind it. So the bushes started just violently shaking, and there was this deep growl. And it was maybe, less than 20 feet away. And I stopped, and I just turned around and said, nope, I'm not going any further in that direction. And then my friend John, and then this was the same area back in 1972 where we first found footprints, and very close to where I had my own encounter 2 years later. So my buddy John, whose house we would go to, that's the trail connected his house and my house. He stayed kind of late one day, too late, and I had my dog go with him, for kind of early warning. I had a collie, and he was a good dog. He followed him, stayed with him. And John found a dead deer up there. His neck was twisted like you would wring a wash rag out. And some of the internal organs were missing. So he quit using the trail, too.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. That was clearly somebody's dinner spot.
It was, absolutely.
I mean, you just, I suppose, as we said earlier, you don't know how close to them you are. But I think sometimes we get a little bit too close. But to me, that distraction, the bluff charge, the shaking of the bush, shows a high-level intelligence. That will move a human. It works. You just have to scare you, and off we go. And I think that shows just a high level of intelligence kind of thing. They're very strategic in what they do, the stone throwing. Little stones that land at the side of people at first, and if they don't take note, then the stones start to become bigger. You hear about them throwing big stones into the river, and that will move the fishermen on. I think they're like honestly like a tribe. An Amazon tribe would do the same thing. You'd scare you away from the area rather than give up their position.
And you see chimps and other apes do it. And one of the distinctions, though, is, and we've had people who know about this, the smaller stones are basically, they're trying to get your attention, like you said, maybe say, hey, you need to not be here. If they're throwing baseball size or larger stones, they're trying to kill you.
Yeah, they just want you. You're not listened, and you need to go.
Exactly.
I mean, you hear people say, I had this feeling that I shouldn't have walked in, but I ignored it and I kept going. And then I've actually done that myself, and I've had the raw, but that was not an experience I enjoyed, and I'm never ever going to go back to that place again. But I had that feeling, and I didn't listen to it. So all my animal senses were saying, no, just go, just turn around and go back. But it's one place of the wood where I don't like going. And the reason it scared me was because I had both of the dogs with me then, and my dogs are not scared of anything. And I've never seen them scared of anything. And my eldest dog put himself between me and the wood. And I didn't know what he was doing at first, because he was annoying me because he kept getting in front of my feet. And I kept ignoring this feeling. And the next thing, he dropped to his belly, and the pup followed suit. And he started, I've never heard him make this noise before. He didn't bark and he didn't growl. He went, as if he was scared of whatever was in there. And that absolutely terrified me. And I've never been back to that wood since. Just something in me. But I think if I'd have gone in and I pushed in and not take notice of the dogs, then maybe I would have got a bit of a blush charge or something thrown at me, because I'd ignored the warning. And I suppose people, sometimes you just stumble in, don't you, to places, and you don't know that they're there, or you don't even know about them, kind of thing. You get that. I saw something out the corner of my eye, comes up a lot. this quick running figure out the corner of my eye, and people say that quite often, or this running feet, but you can't make out where it's coming from. It all seems to be like this really clever distraction to just get you to move away and just not this part of the wood. There's a lady in England called Heather, and she said to me, what if, Deborah, there are certain times of the year that they don't want humans in there, that they're happy with you wandering through it maybe 9 months out of 12, but there are certain times of the year when, because they have to have young, they have to meet in family groups. What if you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time? And that's what some of these bluff charges are, what people call attacks. You know, I was out and I was in the Peak District and I was attacked. And then when you speak to them about it, they've had things thrown at them and they've been chased out and shadowed out. They've been not hands-on attack, but it's an attack to them because it's terrifying.
Yes, exactly. Hey, I want to back up for a second. You said something that really caught my attention. That is, they just make a really, people out of the corner of their eye see like a flash or a real quick movement. Yeah. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Kind of in your peripheral vision. So you'll be out in the woods and you get that feeling that you're being watched, or you suddenly get that feeling that you're not alone, and we should listen to that. And then they won't see a definite figure. They'll see something very quick, moving really fast out the corner of their eye. And when they turn, obviously it's past, it's gone. There was a chap in Sweden who said it, and it was as if something ran past him, but it ran that fast that it was like a blur. As it went past, he caught it out of the corner of his eye. And that just comes up quite often when I'm speaking to witnesses. They'll say, and I didn't really see anything, but I saw something out of the corner of my eye. So I know something was there, but it moved that quickly that I couldn't get eyes on it. That comes up quite often in the British reports.
Well, that's the reason I asked, was because just almost exactly a month and 5 days ago, Will, this is when I was out with Dalton and Joe at an area, and that's exactly what happened. We actually encountered one of these things, and Dalton was the first one to see it. It was just a flash, and he's looking through, like a tunnel in the forest. You can see like a tunnel through all the foliage and the leafy stuff. And it was just a flash, and we got a loud exclamation with some verbiage that he saw it. And about 15 minutes later, we had circled around and come back to where our trucks were, and I saw identically. It was like a tunnel of probably about 70 yards into the forest, and I saw this flash zip by. And I talked to Will about this just the other day. And this is something maybe for your listeners as well, if they're interested, to do a speed, time, distance calculation where you can estimate how much, was it 1 second? Was it half a second? Yeah. And then what was the width of the area? Was it just a little 10-foot area or maybe 5 foot? Yeah, and you can just kind of estimate the speed of what it was.
Do you visit that area often? Is it somewhere you go quite often?
The area where I saw this?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It has a history, quite a history. With the irony is that I had run into some evidence about 35 miles south of there, right. And I went in there with a buddy of mine, and we found these footprints. Will said, "You need to go back, and look at the ground and look around." So I did. I went back, and we found these huge footprints, right. And it was a very remote area. So we came back, and my friend said, "Don't ask. I hate to be hard, but I'm never going back there." So about a month and a half later, I said, "Well, come on. We're going to go to another area, and we're going to go to where they're not."
Yes.
And that's where they were, in buckets.
I don't know if they get used to your presence. If you go in over and over again. Because if they didn't want you to see them, you wouldn't see them. So I'm sure if they are accidental sightings some of the time, maybe like with the habituation sites, they just get less scared of you and maybe more curious about you. So they let the guard down a little bit. Maybe it's a test to see whether you'll come back with guns and army and see, if I show myself to him, what will happen kind of thing. I think they're as curious as we are. I don't know if that's me putting my human spin onto things, but there's an awful lot of accidental sightings where the creature could have just not stepped into the road. You would have drove past, you would never have seen it. And you think, are all of these sightings accidental? Are some of them engineered in some way,
Well, I kind of wondered that too. And especially the ones where you see them crossing the road, which is, I don't know, Will, I think that's like 60% or more of the sightings when they walk across the road in front of a car.
Yeah, John Green said, I think in his calculations, 70% of sightings were on or near roads.
Yeah.
Why don't they just not step out? I don't know, it puzzles me. There's a road in Scotland where the River Tay is, and over a 10-year period, you've got one guy who made a report in 95, and on the same stretch of road, the same roundabout where the road intersects, 10 years later, you've got another guy who makes exactly the same report. He comes out the tree line on the right, crosses right across in front of him in the car, goes into the tree line on the left. In exactly the same spot, 10 years apart.
And you have to remember, roads are game trails. Wildlife will use the path of least resistance, so roads are a natural for them. So if these things are, which they are, they're predators, they're going to follow the game, and that's where they're going to be.
That makes sense. And all of the road killing. We get a lot of deer road killing, rabbits and all kinds of things in the UK. So, yeah, that makes sense. I just always wondered about it. And the same as in the dog walkers make up a lot, unfortunately, in the UK. A lot of reports start with, I was out with the dog, and the dog picks up first. So the dog will make a racket or it'll start trying to pull the person from the area. So at one point, one guy said to me, I actually picked the dog up and she turned around and bit me, and that is not her. She was absolutely terrified. The dogs are onto him straight away, almost. Before the humans do. Is that something that comes up in America?
Oh, all the time. Yes. And that's a question that I've had, and I still have. It's an ongoing question. What is it that the dogs are picking up on? Are they picking up on a scent? Are they picking up on a sound? Unfortunately we can't talk to the dogs.
Probably both.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah. I agree with Will. Yeah, I would imagine dogs pick up on a number of things, don't they? And that's how they know. And you get this, the dog would not carry on down the trail, and it'd start pulling me back, and it didn't want to go into the forest. And I've never seen my dog out like that before. We get that a lot in thickly wooded areas where something could be almost on the tree line.
I can tell you my own collie, all the years I had him, he never shied away from everything. He got a face full of porcupine quills twice because he would just go after anything. And when I had my encounter back in 1974, he ran up to the tree line ahead of me. He froze, on high alert with his ears up, and he spun around and come running back past me as fast as he could run. And I thought, what the heck? I've never seen that dog do that before or since.
That's probably a predator, something much bigger than he feels that he can handle.
I should have paid attention to the dog.
Well, yeah, I say that to people often, because you get people who are nervous, don't you? They listen to the podcast and thing, and then they say, oh, I'm really nervous about it. And I say, well, don't be. Don't let it stop you going back to the woods, Just keep an eye on the dog, or watch what the dog's doing. And if the dog looks uncomfortable, just listen to it and come back out again and, maybe try a different area. Or if you get that feeling where you feel like you're being watched, there's nothing wrong with walking away and just going somewhere else. It might be a human that's watching you or something. You got to listen to these little hints that your gut will give you, because honestly, hominids do it it's natural to them, and it was to us as cavemen. I think we pick up on something without realising it. I usually call it the animal brain. So that feeling of being watched means that your brain's picked up on something, whether you've smelt it, you've heard it, you've sensed it. Take note. Just take note and just be on the safe side.
And it's probably some genetic memory of our dealing with them in prehistory.
Yeah, I agree. Mm.
I've never felt the feeling where I could pinpoint and say I felt like I was being watched, but I did have a couple times, 2 or 3 times, where I felt like, and I was talking to Gerald last night, and he had the best description. It says it felt like being in a graveyard at midnight. It was just that deafening silence.
Yes. Oh, that comes up often, doesn't it? All of a sudden, it went silent. And then when I hear that, I think, that normally means with an animal there's a predator around, doesn't it? The birds go quiet, everything quietens down. But then, unfortunately, they have the encounter.
Yeah, there's a reason everything went quiet.
Yeah. That happens a lot in the canine reports. When I get lots of reports of dogmen, I mean, I get reports of all kinds of creatures, but that happens a lot with them. And they normally, the reports around an ancient burial site or a modern cemetery or something like that. And they usually start with everything went silent. Just, no, you won't find me in a graveyard at night.
Right. So just a kind of a safety tip for everybody out there. If you get that feeling of being in a graveyard at midnight, maybe it's time to turn around.
Yeah, just listen to your instincts. It might keep you on your toes. Yeah. I mean, as researchers, we end up in some scary places. We're in the middle of nowhere. We're on our own. You just have to be sensible about things sometimes, I think. I always advise people not to just rush in. If you're not used to being out there in the outdoors, just make sure you've got water with you. Make sure you've got a couple of lighters on you. You're just one broken ankle away from not coming home that night. You've got to be careful in what you're doing. And in the UK, it's a really new thing, so people are really into looking. They want to find the structures, they want to look at habitat. So there's lots of people in the UK now at weekends and stuff when they're allowed. Just learning about nature for the first time, really, which is absolutely fantastic to see it. There's a real resurgence in, and it's all down to Bigfoot, because of Bigfoot and Sasquatch reports. People are reconnecting with nature in the UK, and I just absolutely love it.
So they're out actually looking for evidence of Sasquatch or the... Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Real hardcore researchers that are out there. We had one guy, I know, Tom, that Northumberland. That's the area in the UK that has a really hard accent. Just on the right. And he went back to the area of his sighting and stayed out there for 4 weeks. The hope being, wild camping down in the bush, hoping, because it was the same time of year that the sighting was, that he'd find something in, the hopes that they're passing through that area. And then he said, I didn't see anything. But, 4 weeks, he's committed to be out there sleeping in the rough for 4 weeks. There's some people that really are, and they find him. We've got decent prints. We've got 2 hair samples that I would consider to be decent hair samples. One of them has no medulla, so there's no medulla running through the middle of the hair.
The medulla. Okay, right.
Yes, yeah. I always pronounce it wrong.
No. Listen, between you and me, now where did the English language originate from? Well, where you're at or where we're at?
You just that's what you look for, isn't it? You think, right. Is this deer hair? Is it horse hair? No. These are 2 decent samples. One of them is from Northumberland. So the area that we're talking about now is about 8 inches long, very dark black, never been cut. So there's no cut end, there's a tapered end and there's a root. So we've got that saved and that's away. And then probably 40, 50 miles to the south of that area, we've got another hair from a feeding spot. And we know that the lady left the food there at about 8:30 in the morning. And when she went back, she leaves apples and things like that out there. When she went back in the afternoon, this hair was there. So it's from that day. So I've got that saved. Same thing again. I've not been able to look at it under a microscope because I don't want to take it out of the forensic packet, because that's how she sent it to me. So I can tell you it's got a tapered end. It's not been cut again. really decent looking, oily, shiny. It seems to have this oily sheen. And they're there in the hopes that at some point somebody will test them. I contacted Oxford University. I've tried a number of things to try and see if somebody would just have a look at them, just to say, oh, no, that's hare, that's deer or that's muntjac or something like that. Not been able to do that yet. So the answer to being is just leave them there until we can. So we've progressed that far that we can do that. There are people out looking for grave sites because there's that ever-ending question of where do the dead go? So we've got people who are used to forensic grave sites, so they understand about the body and the process of death. They're looking for those particular signs that they would look for when looking for ancient burials. So we've got a really good system set up in the UK, and it's just by networking alone that we've been able to do that. So you've got people with all different kind of skill sets, because the witnesses come from every walk of life. So we've got policemen, we've got gamekeepers, we've got people in the army. There's a number of reports from the army, ordinary working folk like myself, just a whole spectrum, and they have skill sets, and we've been able to, if one person knows how to do a forensic collection, then we pass that information on. So other people know how to then, if they come across hair, they know how to take the sample. They know how to cast a print. We don't get the huge square footprints that you see in America. We don't get them in the UK. And when I've been sent them, honestly, they look like they've been stamped into the ground with a mould. There's no foot morphology. There's no movement. There's nothing. We have some very decent tracks where there is all of the above. They look very human, but they can clearly have never worn a shoe. So the toes are not shaped as a human foot is. These are splayed. So what you would have looked for from a wild human, probably about a men's 14 in America, around that size. So we do find footprints in way out places where you wouldn't be seeing people running barefoot. And strangely, in the winter months, we have some decent ones from the winter months. But it's much. So,
has anybody either taken pictures of these footprints, or have they cast them?
Yes, they do. We've got casts of them. We've got images of them. We've got video of them. Because one of the things I started doing years ago, when I say to people, when you come across something, even if you're not sure, take photographs anyway, because we can put it away until we can get somebody to look at it. So I'm in that lucky part where people send me things all the time that they find when they're out. So they'll say, oh, Debbie, I've come across this and I've come across that. And we've been able to now get people to go out, cast the print, because obviously you want to look around the area and see if there's anything else that's going on. You want to, why is there one print in the middle of the field? Why are there no other prints? What, has it used a different method to walk? Is it the ground softer in that area? You want to try and debunk things as much as find them. So we are doing all of that. I just don't think people realise that we're doing it on the scale that we're doing it. So we've been able to discredit a number of structures. We can now identify them as human. So we can say, no, those are human. We'll just forget about them. We don't need to be looking at them. But there is a core, very small core group of anomalies that I cannot explain. It's an almost pinwheel where a number of sticks are interlaced within the tree, all different colours and sizes, but not wood from the area where they are. And they almost remind me of as if you were passing through an area and you left your marker. Because we've been able to watch them over a 6-month period and just not touch them, just take photographs of them randomly. And there are very subtle changes. Some sticks are taken away and others are added. And some are moved. Now, there's no ground disturbance. I'm not seeing any human footprints. I'm not seeing any human rubbish and detriment or out like that in the woods. So it's really interesting in like what's changing it. It's almost like a cairn, if you get what I mean. I'm not sure if that happens in America, whereas you pass through, you leave something. So you know the direction you've gone in, kind of thing. I see. So it's like a marker saying we went this direction. Yeah. Yeah, we were here and we went that way. Yeah, we've definitely heard of that. And one thing I was kind of curious about is in
in Britain or England, are there areas do you still have areas that are maybe not necessarily wilderness, but wide swaths of wooded areas?
Mm-hmm. This is going to astound you, but less than 12% of the UK is urban. And that includes roads, buildings, everything. Only less than 12% is urban. We live in very small conurbations. So you have like London is one huge thing, but the minute you're out of the city limits, you're in country parks and the wilderness and river valleys. River valleys spread all across the UK. We have huge cavern systems. We have systems that go from the top of Scotland all the way to the bottom of Cornwall. There is a vast amount of area. And then people say, well, part of that is farms. Well, it is. But only 70% of farmland is used for cropping. The rest of it's it's left. We have this system where you crop rotate. So a 30% of it's left. So if you're moving, say, from the coast to the mountains, you will pass through thick wooded lands. You'll pass through swamps and like estuaries and marshes where you've got your wading birds and things like that. And then you're into like what we call the best food basket. So you've got all your fruits, your nuts, all your natural food, and as you go through, and then you'll hit the farms. So if you're using the river systems to move around, it's really, really easy to just take what food you want and keep moving. And then if you're following the day, you're going to go to high country when it's the time of the rut or, depending on what you do. So it's just all there for you, if you get what I mean. If you could imagine living like an early tribe or something like that, it'd be really easy to do in the UK. And there are people that do it. There are a lot of people who live out there in the wilds. Sure,
yeah. And another thing that I find interesting is the UK has reestablished these canal systems for the narrow boats, and I would imagine that would be another kind of a possible pathway. I don't know if those canals have fish or crawfish. You
can fish them. A lot of the canals are actual river systems. So there'll be natural rivers, and then we'll canal them through the cities, because most of the UK it's either been raised on coal, cotton, mill work, that kind of thing. So back in the day, that's how we moved that commodity through the country. My town's is a canal town because it's an industrial place, it's a mill town. So the only work back in the 80s really was factory, mill, and the pit. So if you get, that's what you're kind of looking at, kind of thing. And you've got all of those canal systems, and many of them are not used anymore. So I think I'd get the statistic wrong, but we don't use all of them. So say a quarter of them are just left. And you people go along them if weekends and things like that. But yeah, they stock with fish. They become a river again as they leave the town. And you could get from the tip of England all the way to the tip of Scotland by just using the river sources themselves, because they by-skirt the cities. The cities are always on the edges of them. So even though the Thames runs through London, the Thames Valley stretches for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and it's marshes and woodland and wilderness and nature reserves. And if you follow one river system, so we'll use the Medway because that's where the Thames is. There are 17 reports along that river. So...
Oh, that's interesting.
So that's why I thought, right, stop looking at cities and towns, Deb, and start looking at rivers. So look at the Trent. And the Trent obviously has an estuary and as it flows, and there are 11 accounts on the Trent. So that's kind of how I look at things now. The first thing I do when I get a sighting report is I look for the river. And really strange things like railway lines and golf courses pop up over and over again. I don't know.
Yeah, we get here in the States. We get reports out of golf courses and railroad lines, trestles and that sort of thing. So, listen, Deb, this has been an absolute treat talking to you, and I insist that we stay in touch and we do this again. This is just too interesting.
Absolutely.
I hope I haven't taught your ears off, though.
Oh, no.
Oh, no,
Been
not
very
at
good.
all. No.
It's been wonderful, actually. It's really nice to speak to people who really understand the subject, you know, and you're not having to explain yourself all the time. It's been very freeing.
Well, and I got to say that it's been really an education for us as well to hear everything that you're experiencing in the UK is mirroring and parallels what we experience not only here in North America, but worldwide. So we're going to stay in touch. And if you wouldn't mind, send us the links on the history. And if you have some pictures that you'd like us to post on the website, we'd love to do that.
Yeah.
As well as, now, do you have a website?
I do. It's just called Wildman UK. I have a YouTube channel, and that's just my name, Deborah Hatswell. And I do a Spreaker podcast as well. Patreon. I have all of those kind of links. I'll send them over to you. And
Send them all over, and we'll put those on our show. Absolutely.
And I will give you Randy's details. I'll message him in the morning, and I'll tell him that I've spoken to you, and I'll give you his details, and you can have a chat with him and see how that goes.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Debbie. We appreciate it.
Good night.
Thanks, Debbie. Good night.
Welcome. This collection of 5 stories is being brought to you by William Jevning, and is being narrated by me, Jim Sower. Number 1 is The Zoobies. Number 2, Bruce Peninsula. Number 3, Bigfoot Buzz. Number 4, Waterton National Park. And number 5, Milestones on the Mighty Fraser River. Story number 1. The Zoobies, 1971. Alpine, San Diego County, California. 1992 interview with Sergeant Doug Hughes, San Diego County Sheriff's Department. Interviewer: Okay, just go ahead and tell me about yourself, when you started working there, and so on. Hughes: I started working the Alpine area, east of San Diego, California, in March of 1970. I came to the department the previous year. I was working out there in a patrol capacity for the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. I was a deputy at the time and actually worked Alpine for about 2 years, from March of 1970 to April of 1972. As far as trying to recall exactly when this went down, the best I can come up with is that it was after the Laguna Fire of 1970, September of 1970. Interviewer: The Laguna Fire affected which areas? Hughes: Well, it was the largest brush fire at the time in California history. It burned specifically in the Sweetwater River area from east of Alpine all the way south and west, probably another 15 miles. It was quite an extensive burn, and through the area in question, Alpine, on the south side of Interstate 8. To recall the chain of events, it was extremely cold, which means the time of year would have been sometime after September of 1970, probably December or January, maybe February. Let's see, that would be 1971. Well, it was definitely winter. Interviewer: Was that about the time of your first contact with the key witness, Dr. Badur? Prominent San Diego psychiatrist. Hughes: Yes, and I don't recall the reason, but Dr. Badur was stopped by a 2-man patrol unit. Badur was traveling eastbound, which would have been from the San Diego area to what we learned later was his home in Alpine. On the front seat of his car, I don't remember what kind of car it was, he had a loaded .44 Magnum revolver with a 6-inch barrel. That's the same type of gun that Dirty Harry made famous. It's the largest caliber handgun you can buy. Of course, this piqued our interest a little bit. It wasn't the contact, it was what we call the cover during this particular stop. My partner's the one who made first contact and found the gun. He secured the revolver and was asking the doctor, who identified himself as Dr. Badur, why he was carrying the weapon. Badur said it was because of a and I don't know what he actually said at the time, but my partner heard him say Zuby. And so, from there on, all of our conversations throughout the department referred to whatever Dr. Badur had seen as a Zuby. That wasn't what the doctor actually called it, I don't believe, but that's what my partner heard, and that's how the name got coined. Interviewer: At the time, did Dr. Badur describe the Zuby to the officer? Hughes: Yes, he did, to both of us, as a matter of fact. He described the Zuby as a large, upright, walking, hairy creature. Dr. Badur convinced us, and later other members of my department, including one of my patrol sergeant, that in truth he had had 3 separate encounters with the Zubys. Interviewer: Did Dr. Badur say how many of these Zubys there were and where the sightings happened? Hughes: Yeah, one sighting was made by his entire family within the confines of his yard and immediate area, and one time they saw 3 Zubys. What Dr. Badur described to us was what he assumed was a father, mother, and child, with the largest of the Zubys being over 6 feet tall, maybe 7 feet tall. The tallest was very hairy and much larger framed than the ordinary man. What he described as the mother was about 5 feet tall, and the smaller one was about 3 or 4 feet tall. Like I said, the doctor convinced a number of us that he'd in fact seen something unusual. What happened then was that we did get involved in an investigation of the sightings. I did because of the shift I worked, which was either 10 p.m. at night to 6 a.m., or what we called the evening or overlap shift, which was from 6 p.m. to 2:30 in the morning. Neither of those shifts was conducive to interviewing citizens in the area, so I wasn't able to locate other witnesses. And I can't recall if I ever talked to a deputy who canvassed the area looking for witnesses. Interviewer: How many people lived in the area at the time? Hughes: There were very few homes, probably 5 or no more than 6 residences, and Badur's was the last home on the narrow road. Going back in my memory 20 years now, I'd say his house was a quarter to a third of a mile off the main road used to get to his place, almost in a straight line due south of Alpine Boulevard. That area hasn't grown much since then. No planned residential development in there. At that time, the Badur family themselves consisted of the doctor, his wife, a daughter, and a son. The daughter was 17, and the son was younger, maybe 13 or 14. Interviewer: Can you describe what the terrain looks like? Is it actually alpine forest, etc.? Hughes: It's not a forest by any means. The elevation's no more than 2,300 feet. The road goes east and up, and in about another 20 miles it eventually climbs to about 5,000 feet. Interviewer: Does it continue up into forested areas? Hughes: Yes, it does, and it follows the Sweetwater River. It's about 10 miles. The Sweetwater River isn't much of a flowing river. It runs about 3/4 of a mile south of Dr. Badur's place. Of course, it always depends on the rainfall, but the river hasn't run continuously any time in the last 20 years I've been familiar with the area. There's no snowfall at all. The terrain itself is quite steep behind Dr. Badur's property, going down into the Sweetwater River bottom itself. It's all primarily brush and chaparral. Interviewer: Any bears in the area? Hughes: Well, I don't think I've ever heard of a bear sighting in San Diego County, and again, I've been in the area almost 23 years. We have deer everywhere here, along with coyotes and fox and other types of wildlife, but no bears. What else do you remember about Dr. Badur's sightings? Hughes: Well, let's see. The first set of circumstances I remember was Dr. Badur finding damage to the house when he'd just moved in. He said he'd bought the house from an older German couple, and all of the light bulbs, inside and out, were the yellow bug repellent type. Badur said the German man told me that he shouldn't change them to white, that he should get used to the yellow light. Interviewer: Because of an insect problem? Hughes: Well, Badur said the German was very evasive about that. Evasive also about a lot of details regarding the house and property. The property did have some acreage. I don't recall the size, but it was larger than a city lot anyway. The property had some fruit trees in the front and backyards. I don't remember what kind of fruit trees they were, but the house and trees were surrounded by a fence. One of Badur's complaints was that fruit was being picked off the trees at the tops, but not from the bottoms. The trees were upward of 7 or 8 feet high, or maybe 10 feet high. Anyway, the fruit was disappearing from the tops of his trees, and his fence was getting knocked down. He had a wind chime at one of the doors, made of brass or some kind of strong metal, which frequently rang in the blowing wind, and at one point the wind chime suddenly turned up flattened. Badur couldn't explain it, and we couldn't duplicate it. It was smashed. Badur did make a plaster cast of a footprint, and I know we had photographs of it, if we didn't in fact have a plaster cast of the print ourselves. But I do recall there was a plaster cast. Interviewer: Do you remember the approximate size of the footprint? Hughes: Oh, I'm 6'3", and I wear a size 12 shoe, and I'd have to say that this one was larger than my shoe and much wider than my foot. I'd say it was about 13 or 14 inches in length, and I've been racking my brain trying to remember if it had 4 toes or 5 toes, but I just can't recall. According to researcher Ken Kuhn, who visited the Alpine area in 1971, Dr. Badur's zoobies left V-shaped, 4-toed footprints, 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, with the widest measurement across the toes. The foot narrowed down to 5 inches at the heel. Interviewer: But there's some recollection that it might have been an unusual number of toes? Hughes: Yes, I do seem to remember that, but I can't bring it to mind. I know the footprint was wide overall and less wide at the heel, but the heel was still wider than a human foot would be. Interviewer: Did you or any of the officials talk to the doctor's wife or kids? Hughes: Well, specifically the word came back to me, and I'm not sure which deputy found out, but the daughter said she had a sighting in the early morning hours as she boarded a school bus at Alpine Boulevard. That would have been adjacent to the access road leading to the Badur house. She was getting on the bus and spotted the creature off in the brush. There's some very thick, very tall brush along the road there. Interviewer: Do you remember any details of what she saw? Hughes: No, not really. The man who was deeply involved in this was my patrol sergeant, and he's now deceased. He was so involved with it that on his days off he'd go up there and camp to the rear of the Badur's house. He'd take his older son along, and the two of them would camp out in hope of getting a glimpse of one of the zoobies. They never did, but he was the man who probably had more conversations with the doctor than anybody else. Another sighting involved 3 zoobies sighted by a whole family. The Badurs had made it a habit to never go out after dark, but one night they were out with the son to call in their pet dog. In the dark, the boy thought he saw the dog near the corner of the house and called out to it. Well, the dog came running back, but from a different corner, and what at first they thought was the dog turned out to be the smaller zoobie. Apparently, it had been laying down, and it got up and stood and walked the opposite way, joining the other 2, the larger male and female, and they all walked off into the brush. Interviewer: Did they ever use words like ape or gorilla to describe the creatures? Hughes: No, they never did. Badur was firm in his own mind that it wasn't an ape or gorilla. It was something totally different than one of those. Well, for lack of anything better, we thought it to be more like the California Bigfoot, based on how it was described. Whether it was black or brown, I really can't remember. Interviewer: Did Dr. Badur ever use the word Bigfoot or Sasquatch to describe the zoobie? Hughes: Not to me, no. As a matter of fact, we were assigned to make periodic checks of his residence throughout the night because most of the damage to his property was done during the nighttime. So my partner and I, in a two-man car, would drive up there and shine the spotlight around his house. Dr. Badur was very convincing. I can still picture him coming outdoors one night, dressed in his skivvies and wearing black high-top military boots. That was it, a T-shirt and shorts with those black military boots carrying that big .44 Magnum. Interviewer: How would you characterize the family? It sounds as though they were all educated. Credible people? Hughes: Yes, I'd characterize them exactly that way. I got to the impression that the daughter was very intelligent, and of course Badur himself was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist. Interviewer: In our earlier phone call to arrange the interview, you mentioned something about the creatures, the zoobies, mimicking human speech? Hughes: Yes. One of the lighter stories I recall happened when the doctor got home after dark one night. They had chickens there, and earlier he'd called his wife to say he was going to be late and remind her to feed the chickens before nightfall, which she did. When the doctor got home, he had to exit his car, open the gate, drove through and stopped, then got out of the car again to close the gate behind him. He said that when he went to close the gate that night, he heard a very low, very guttural voice say, "Here, chickie, chickie, chickie." Interviewer: That's funny, and not unprecedented in the research. Are you saying the impression was that one of the creatures was imitating the doctor's wife, who called in the chickens earlier? Hughes: Exactly. It was the doctor's opinion, and we had no reason to doubt him, that the Zubi had some type of intelligence and the capability of producing sound like that. Interviewer: Did they ever describe any other sounds or smells, anything like that? Hughes: Smells, yes. A very pungent odor. Maybe like rotting garbage. You know, he did tell us he'd set up cameras around his house with tripwires, but he wasn't able to get any photographs, at least not while I was working in the area. I really can't recall, but I know the doctor himself had a close sighting of one of the Zubis, and there were probably other sightings, but I can't remember now. Of course, I worked up there for just 2 years, until April of 1972. After that, I went to flying helicopters, so I was completely out of touch with what was happening in Alpine, and I didn't get back there until 1981. At that time, I was stationed east of the Badur home, and I didn't hear anything more. I did hear something about the Proctor Valley monster when I started patrol in 1970, which, if true, I'd have to assume was on the order of what Dr. Badur was describing. Now, a few years ago, a deputy told me he saw a dark-colored, large, upright, furry creature, not a bear, not a human, up in some rocks north of Interstate 8, and possibly northwest of El Capitan Reservoir. The deputy told me it was a good distance away. Also, I was involved in a juvenile diversion camp near Julian, northeast of Alpine, and a couple of counselors from another camp came down and told us they'd seen something they couldn't identify in the mountains. After talking with them, it was concluded that what they'd seen was probably a Zubi. Another thing we found out during our investigation of Dr. Badur's sightings was that the Viejas Indians Reservation, just north of Interstate 80, had a legend about a giant hairy man that was the protector of their burial grounds. And those burial grounds were located just about 2 miles north of where Dr. Badur lived. Updated in 2006. Note: the 1971 Alpine incident is described in John Green's book, Sasquatch, The Apes Among Us, pages 311 through 312. Dr. Badur no longer lives in Alpine, but his family is somewhere in San Diego County. The house is now slightly different, but looks much as it did in the 70s. The terrain's the same, now more populated, steep and dry and full of thicket. Throughout the years, attempts to interview Dr. Badur by researchers not involved in the initial investigations have failed. As recently as July of 1992, the doctor, who currently has an active practice in San Diego, still refused to comment at length on his family's bygone experiences, saying only that he's going to tell the whole story in an upcoming book. But 35 years later, no book has been published. Dr. Badur implied that the Zubis of Alpine altered his view of reality, and, he said, his book, along with the truth about Zubis, will impact mankind. The original report was attributed to Detective Ken Kuhn, a former Los Angeles police detective. Kuhn spent a considerable amount of time investigating the Badur report. He came away convinced the sightings were authentic. That's the end of the number one story, the Zubis. Story number 2, Bruce Peninsula, Ontario, Canada, 2012. I grew up in a little town on the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. We lived on the river, and past our property was nothing but pristine bush for miles. I remember one day as a small child being scared speechless when I looked into the tree line and saw Sasquatch. It was only 15 feet from me and was watching, and I froze with fear. Then it turned and walked into the bush. I was about 8 years old at the time. 5 years later, I moved up to our cabin, and that summer, late at night, 3 a.m, for about 2 weeks, I could hear something echoing up the river valley, and so life went on. At the age of 19, after being evicted from a house I was staying at, I moved into the most remote woods I could think of, to where I thought I could live undisturbed. It was near the end of March, and tough living out there with nothing, but I built a small place for shelter in a thicket and lived by the fire. The forest there is so alive and full of life, I used to listen to all the different animals that would frequently circle my place. One night, I came back from a trip into the nearest town. It was 3 a.m. I just arrived at my place after the long walk and sat down to listen, as I always did, and heard footsteps walking in the same place I had just walked. Unmistakable, heavy footsteps. It was something on 2 feet, and then it just stopped about 25 feet from where I was, and it didn't make a sound. It wasn't until that moment that I remembered the screams I used to hear when I was younger, and that I was now living in the approximate spot downstream from where I used to live. I didn't move, and neither did it. So, after 40 minutes, I just went to sleep. I'm 42 now, and thinking back, what a perfect place for a Sasquatch to live. There is no bush quite like that of the Bruce Peninsula. I still roam the forests alone, day and night, unafraid but always respectful of nature. There is so much we don't know or understand, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I know what I saw, and I know what I heard, and I truly believe. Oh, how lucky I am to have had these experiences and others as well. Most people don't experience these things because they aren't out there living in harmony with nature. I know the Sasquatch meant me no harm, just curious about me living on its turf. That's it in a nutshell. In another forest I encountered 2 entities, but that is another story. If you want to hear it, let me know. I've never really shared these stories, but I figured someone might be interested in hearing them. Battery is dying now. Gotta go. Jonathan Burroughs, September 25th, 2012, 11:19 p.m. This is the end of story number 2, Bruce Peninsula. Story number 3, Bigfoot Buzz, by Linnell Sinclair and Lauren Olson. December 2005. Factoid: the name the Modoc Indians of California call Bigfoot is Mata Kagni, circa 1897, Tanzi Buzhu. This is our first column for the First Perspective newspaper, and we are both really excited about the following stories that we are sharing with you. We started this column in the previous month for the Manitoba Provincial Aboriginal newspaper, The Drum. We want you to know that when you email us, we will not share your name. We respect your privacy, and we know from first-hand experience the difficulties of sharing stories like these. We've been researching Sasquatch for years now, and we have tons of stories to share with you. Here are some stories. We hope that you enjoy reading them as much as we have compiling them. This photograph shows a track imprint which was measured at 19 inches long and 11 inches wide across the toes, photographed by Linnell Sinclair in late spring 2001 near Grand Rapids, Manitoba. Our first story comes from the Lake of the Woods, a provincial park bordering on eastern Manitoba and northwestern Ontario. Jessica was camping with her 2 friends. They were the only people at this particular campground that weekend. The girls pitched their tent and enjoyed their evening. They settled down for the evening and went to sleep. Sometime during the night, something started howling around their campsite. This woke up the 2 girls, but Jessica continued to sleep blissfully unaware of what was going on. The 2 girls were both frightened because something was outside making all kinds of noise, howling, grunting, and circling their tent. Whenever it got close to where they were standing in their tent, they would move to the other side. Her 2 friends, meanwhile, were watching while Jessica was starting to be pushed by something from the outside of the tent. Jessica was still sleeping while this was happening. The amazing thing was, whatever it was made her turn over while she was sleeping. Jessica didn't wake up. The stranger continued to circle their camp and drop what they discovered to be, in the morning, pine cones on the top of their tent. Eventually it left, and the girls did not sleep for the rest of the night. About 4 a.m, Jessica woke up. She heard weird howling far off in the woods. The next morning the girls left and were quite shaken by what had happened. It was in the late fall, just past midnight, when our next report happened. The witness was driving on Highway 50 on her way to Sandy Bay, Manitoba. Sandy Bay, Ojibwe First Nation reserves in Manitoba. As she was driving, she suddenly spotted something squatting on the side of the road. She swerved to miss it and, at the same time, turned to see what it was. Her mouth went dry and her heart beat faster as she realized it was a sabe. Sabe, Sasquatch. It was holding something with both hands and eating it, perhaps roadkill. It seemed to move in slow motion as it lifted its head to look up at her passing by in her vehicle. The witness looked directly into its face, which was covered by dark hair, and its eyes appeared to be small and beady. Its face reminded her of a gorilla. It was swarmed by what appeared to be a cloud of mosquitoes. It looked hunchback because of the way it was sitting on the road. The sabi appeared to show no fear, even though she had almost hit it. As she passed it, she swerved into the other lane, and when she was about 75 feet away from where it was, she slammed on the brakes. She turned back to look at the sabi, and that's when it stood up on 2 legs, very fluidly and gracefully. She screamed and stepped on the gas pedal, fearing it would approach her. She drove like a maniac to her family's home and told a relative what she had seen, crying while she talked. The relative had difficulty believing this incredible story, as do most people when they are told these stories. She had a hard time sleeping that night, and to this day she doesn't drive alone at night on this highway, and she feels anxious when she drives through the area. The third story comes from an unusual setting, a honeymoon. Mary and Joe were on their honeymoon and stopped off the highway in Oregon's beautiful mountains to take a picture. They got out of the car, and Joe climbed up an embankment and posed. Mary snapped his picture, and they carried on. After returning home to Winnipeg, they started showing their honeymoon pictures to friends. One friend gasped at the picture of Joe standing on the outcrop and asked if they were afraid of what stood behind him. Unbeknownst to them, at the time the picture was taken, a dark figure was standing behind him. Though this figure is some distance in the back of Joe, it still appears larger than he is. Both Mary and Joe cannot remember any unusual smell or seeing any tracks at that site. It is possible they may have stumbled onto the path of this Bigfoot and caught it off guard, and it curiously looked on for the moment that humans were there. A man from Alberta was visiting his relatives in BC when he and his cousin went swimming in a remote lake area. His cousin Fred returned to the shore ahead of him while he continued swimming for a while. He decided to sneak up on his cousin and swim quietly just below the surface to shore. Partly seeing what he thought was Fred standing on the shore, he jumped out of the water to startle him, but instantly became startled himself. Before him stood a large, hairy man figure, between 7 and 8 feet tall. He noticed it was very muscular, but thoroughly covered with black hair. He thought it looked eerily similar to a human. His cousin was nowhere in sight. This encounter lasted only a few seconds, as he and the creature startled each other and ran in opposite directions. He said he was not happy to have had this rare encounter and will not return to that area. That is the end of story number 3, Bigfoot Buzz. Story number 4, Waterton National Park, Alberta, Canada. Near Waterton National Park, Alberta, Canada, May 2002. During my training as a tour guide for Glacier National Park, I decided to take a trip on another guide's bus to see Waterton. This would be in late May of 2002. We were coming back from Waterton, still in Canada, when the driver, tour guide, pointed out what appeared to be a fisherman walking along the river. The other tourists didn't seem too interested, but I was. I noticed that the so-called fisherman was walking funny, strange gait to his walk. I then looked closer to see that this being moved with an ape-like walk and was naked, as in no clothes, but hairy all over. And when I was a child around 4 or 5, living in Arizona, I went camping with my parents near a place called Strawberry. We had been fishing early in the morning. My parents were cooking fish for lunch, so I decided to climb up on the top of a boulder near our campsite. When I got on top of the rock, I noticed through the pine branches a face staring right at me. It had a calm look on its face and was very tall. We were eye to eye. I also noticed that it was naked and hairy all over. My parents came back to pick me up for lunch, and this being ran away into the woods. A few weeks later, I saw a movie based on In Search of Bigfoot. I had nightmares for a few years. I now know that this being did not wish me harm. It was just curious. I remember the next day walking around the boulder and seeing huge footprints. Thank you for your site. I feel you have the most informative site on the internet. I still am in search of this being we call Bigfoot. I will keep you up to date on any new information I come across. Scott Barlow, Jr. Tuesday, January 7th, 2003, 10:19 a.m. This is the end of story number 4. Story number 5, Milestones on the Mighty Fraser, Bannock Bread, Use of Fire, by C.P. Lyons, pages 28, 29, and 30. As you read this, bear in mind the book was published in 1950, probably researched and compiled in the late 30s or 40s, certainly long before tabloid newspapers, general media interest, and the Internet wreaked havoc with the facts. Hairy Giants, Laidlaw, British Columbia, is a small station on the Canadian National Railroad. Close to it is an Indian reserve. There are many such small reserves along the Fraser River, but this one had the doubtful honor, not long ago, of playing unwilling host to a fearsome hairy giant. The oral story of the Indians has it that a mysterious race of giants, known as the Sasquatch, live in the high mountains around Harrison Lake. Over the years, various Indians have reported brief encounters with these individuals. Such stories are not easily discounted, for the Indians have a remarkable memory for detail and find little purpose in distorting the facts as they know them. Various people in close contact with the Indians have no doubts that, at least, the remnants of such a race of giants do exist in the hidden vastness of the coastal mountains. One or two expeditions have been attempted to investigate, but were forced back by extremely rough and hostile terrain. The following instances are only two of the many stories told by the Indians. An Indian woman living near Laidlaw related them in all seriousness. Over 100 years ago, roughly 1850, when the Indians were berry picking, one woman who had strayed from the others was suddenly confronted by a giant. Too paralyzed with fear to scream or run, she was quickly carried up the steep mountainside. After a long climb, during which time she remained in a semi-coma, and so did not note direction or length of time, she was carried through a rough door into a large rock cave. Two other Indian women were crouched in the cave and, when left alone with the new arrival, told her they had been captured in a similar manner years ago. They had been brought as wives for the giants and had since borne children. The men giants would disappear for months at a time and then return with food. For the new woman they brought flour and smoked fish that they knew she was accustomed to eating. The fact that there was flour dates this story as taking place after the arrival of the Hudson's Bay traders in 1827 to 1840. Although the woman had been a captive for over a year and had borne a child, she was determined to escape. The other two women told her they would help, and when the hairy giants left on one of their seasonal hunting trips, she was told to prepare all the food she could. She made bread, or bannock, suggesting that these giant people, or the Indian women, at least used fire and, with a heavy pack of food, set out across the mountains. Bannock traditionally was a large, round, cake-like bread that required baking. It was usually made from barley, wheat, or oatmeal, often combined with elk or moose lard, varying according to region. After almost unendurable hardships, she became exhausted and was carried and helped along by the other two women who possessed the giant's strength in some measure. She was left in a stupor near where she had originally disappeared. The villagers saw her, but she suddenly became afraid of them and fled. She was pursued and carried to her father's house, where she fainted and remained under a spell. Perhaps nervous collapse from the birth and year-long ordeal. The Indians believed that the giants held some mental power over her, but with careful nursing she eventually recovered. The second episode is still fresh in many of the Indians' memories. Several years ago, in the vicinity of Laidlaw, a hairy giant entered a house and caused a woman and her two children to flee in terror. Later, footprints approximately 20 inches long were found clearly imprinted in the mud along the route the woman had taken. although she was not captured, she has since refused to live in the house. Hair was caught in the door jamb and was reportedly reddish in color. A 40-gallon barrel of salted fish had been picked up and dumped over, and the retreating footprints showed that the Sasquatch had merely stepped over the railroad fences and returned directly to the steep mountain slopes. At the end of the book's excerpt on the Indians and the Sasquatch, Lyon's report mentions the use of fire to bake bread, or bannock, but leaves us to wonder if the Indian woman had used fire, the Sasquatch used it, or just tolerated her use of fire, and whether or not the Sasquatch and native offspring survived. The text also suggests the Sasquatch had knowledge of what the captive Indian woman liked, and where to go to get it, but offers no conclusion, leaving the reader with more questions than answers. Bobby Short. Lyons, Chester Peter, Chess, 1915, December 20th, 1998, was a Canadian-born outdoorsman and natural historian who penned Milestones on the Mighty Fraser, published by J.M. Dent and Sons, Canada, 1950. Milestone in Ogopogo Land, in which the many wonders of the land of Ogopogo and Sunshine are revealed, 1957. Milestones on Vancouver Island. The story of this island to the west, its past and its present, 1958. This ends the reading of the 5 stories. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Creek Devil. If you or anyone you know has had an encounter with these creatures, please contact us at williamjevning@yahoo.com. That's William, Jevning, @yahoo.com. All communication is confidential. Join us for another program next week. And until then, keep your eyes open out there.